Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Watch Harry, presenting to you today. Harry woke on September 1st, remembered his past 9 lives and refused every role Dumbledore designed. Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1. The morning he remembered everything. The first thing Harry noticed was that the ceiling was the wrong color. Not wrong in any dramatic sense, no cosmic wrongness, no shattering vision. Just the flat, water-stained gray of the cupboard ceiling where it had always been, 2 inches above his nose, exactly as unremarkable as every other morning of his 11 years. But Harry lay still and stared at it, and somewhere behind his eyes, 9 other ceilings stacked themselves up like pages in a book. Stone vaults and silk canopies and open sky and lacquered wood and the cold white plaster of a Parisian apartment where he died coughing blood onto a revolutionary pamphlet. He didn't sit up immediately. He just breathed. It wasn't painful, the remembering. That surprised him, distantly. He'd half expected, well, he hadn't expected anything, because the part of him that was 11-year-old Harry Potter hadn't known to expect this at all. But the part of him that was everything else, the part that had apparently been waiting very patiently behind a door that had now swung open, noted with mild professional interest that the integration was remarkably clean. Like waking up fluent in a language you'd never consciously studied. Like finding a room in your house you'd always somehow missed. 9 lives. Complete. Intact. His. General Lucius Aemilius, who had understood politics the way other men understood weather, as a force to be read, not trusted. Empress Wu Hua, who had held an empire together with one hand and a smile that nobody ever read correctly until it was far too late. Ibrahim al-Rashid, who had mapped the stars and understood that the universe had no particular interest in human convenience. Kofi Asante, who had been a king and a poet and the best fighter in 4 kingdoms, who had died with a spear through his ribs laughing at the men who thought killing him was a victory. Giacomo Vitali, the alchemist, the first life where magic had flickered to the surface like a fish rising through dark water. Takeda Hiroshi, who had spent 40 years reducing everything complicated about violence to something almost meditative. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, who had believed in liberty so completely that watching it become a guillotine had broken something in him that never quite healed. Edmund Blackwell, the occultist, who had learned more about real magic in 20 years than most wizards managed in a lifetime and who had died fighting something genuinely monstrous. And Rajan Mehta, most recently, who had healed people and believed in human dignity and died on a dusty road in 1947 with more peace in his chest than most men found in a full life. Harry Potter. 10th life. 11 years old. Lying in a cupboard under the stairs on the 1st of September, 1991, with a Hogwarts letter that had already been accepted and a scar on his forehead that meant someone had already tried to kill him once. He pressed 2 fingers to the scar, lightly. He remembered Voldemort. Not the nursery, he'd been too young that night, even 9 lifetimes of accumulated experience couldn't conjure a coherent memory from an infant's panicked senses, but he remembered of him. The way you remembered a rumor about a powerful person before you'd met them. Enough to understand the shape of the threat. Enough, also, to recognize that Voldemort was not, in fact, the most dangerous thing he would face this year. That realization settled into him with the particular weight of hard experience. He'd known kings who told themselves they were protecting their people while they moved those people around a board like pieces. He'd known revolutionary committees that sincerely believed in the revolution right up until the moment they signed the execution orders. Good intentions and control were not mutually exclusive, and the combination was, in many ways, more dangerous than simple malice. Simple malice you could fight cleanly. Albus Dumbledore. Headmaster. The architect. Harry had enough of a political mind, several lifetimes' worth, to see the shape of what had been built around him. The Dursleys. The neglect. The specific variety of neglect that kept a child small and grateful and desperate for approval. The magical world's mythology about the boy who lived, the lightning bolt scar, the chosen one, the savior. the letter arriving with clockwork certainty the moment he turned 11. The carefully designed first year at Hogwarts that would, bit by bit, build a boy who would walk into death when asked. He didn't feel angry about it. Not yet, and maybe not ever in the sharp, reactive way an 11-year-old without his memories might have. Anger was expensive and he'd learned, over several lifetimes, to spend his emotions deliberately. What he felt was something colder and more final. A decision. He was not going to play that role. He sat up. Hit his head on the shelf above him. Looked at the shelf with the specific expression of a man who had once been a Japanese swordmaster and found the indignity somewhat beneath comment, and then unfolded himself from the cot and stood in the tiny sliver of standing room the cupboard allowed. His trunk was already packed. He'd done it last week, moving with a quiet efficiency that had confused and vaguely unsettled Aunt Petunia, who had expected more anxious fumbling. He pulled it toward the door, opened the latch, and stepped out into the hallway of number 4, Privet Drive. The house smelled like Petunia's cleaning products and Dudley's trainers. The morning light through the kitchen windows was the particular thin yellow of early September, and Vernon Dursley was already at the table with his newspaper and his enormous cup of tea, and he looked up at Harry over the paper with the reflexive contempt that had, for 10 years, been Harry's entire context for understanding what he was worth. Harry looked back at him with the collected calm of a man who had, among other things, once faced down an Imperial Roman death squad, and pulled his trunk to the kitchen doorway. "I'll need a ride to King's Cross," Harry said. "Not asked." Said. Vernon's eyebrows went up. "You'll need," he stopped, because something in Harry's voice or face was doing something unfamiliar, and Vernon Dursley was a man highly attuned to social power even if he couldn't have articulated what he was sensing. "You're not in charge here, boy." "Platform 9 3/4, Harry continued, in exactly the same tone. "I need to be there by 11. It's currently 7:15. Given traffic on a Saturday morning, we should leave by 9:30 at the latest." Petunia appeared in the kitchen doorway from the hall, wearing her dressing gown, and looked between Harry and Vernon with the expression of someone watching a weather vane spin in an unexpected direction. "He'll get himself there," Vernon said, recovering his bluster. "Not our problem." "It very much is your problem," Harry said pleasantly. "I am 11 years old. I have no money on the Muggle side, my school funds are in Gringotts, which I cannot access independently. If I don't make that train, I don't start school. If I don't start school, I remain here." He paused. "I don't think any of us wants that." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that falls when someone has efficiently removed every exit from a room. Vernon put his newspaper down. 9:30, he said flatly. "Lovely," Harry said, and began making himself breakfast with the comfort of a person entirely at home in his own kitchen, which, after 10 lifetimes, he more or less was. Dudley came downstairs at 8 and looked at Harry with his habitual bully's assessment, the weighing of weakness, the search for something to poke, and apparently found nothing useful, because he went to the refrigerator without saying anything and stood there for a long moment before glancing back at Harry with something that wasn't quite unease but was in the same neighborhood. Harry said, "Morning, Dudley," and Dudley said, "Yeah," and that was the end of that. Petunia watched Harry eat his toast with the particular intensity of a woman trying to solve a puzzle. He could feel it. She had known, in her way, that he was different from the start, not just magically different, but something else, some quality she'd never been able to name and had responded to by trying to stamp it out. He felt no bitterness toward her for it. He'd known people in other lives who responded to the inexplicable with suppression. It was a very human thing to do. "Petunia," he said, not unkindly. She startled. He almost never addressed her directly. "Thank you," he said. "For the years here." She stared at him. "I know that's not how either of us would describe them," he continued, spreading marmalade on his second piece of toast. "But you kept me alive when you didn't have to, and that counts for something." The look on Petunia's face was extraordinary. It cycled through about 6 distinct emotions in 3 seconds and settled somewhere between confused and wounded, which was probably the most honest her face had been in years. She didn't say anything. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat down at the opposite end of the table and looked out the window, and Harry let her have that, because some things didn't need more words. The drive to King's Cross was silent except for Vernon's radio too and the occasional creak of the trunk in the boot. Harry watched London pass by the window and let himself feel the particular sensation of a new beginning. He'd had 9 of them. They never got old. Each life was its own thing, its own weight and texture and set of people who would matter. He'd learned to be present in them. He'd also learned, painfully in a few cases, not to protect himself from caring about those people just because he knew, somewhere in the back of his awareness, that it would eventually end. He would care about this life fully. That was the point. What he would not do was let someone else script it. Vernon pulled up outside King's Cross at 9:58 and sat in the driver's seat while Harry unloaded his trunk and his owl, Hedwig, a snowy owl who had arrived with his Hogwarts letter and who was looking at the London morning with extreme disdain, and then, because he was not a man who half-committed to things even when the other person probably didn't deserve the full commitment, Harry leaned in through the car window. If Dudley tries for Smeltings boxing next year, he should look at his footwork, Harry said. He leads with his left shoulder before he throws right. Anyone who spends 5 minutes watching him will take him apart. Vernon Dursley stared at him. Harry straightened, picked up his trunk, and walked toward the station. He found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 without any difficulty. The memory was in him from the letter, from the magical world's general ambient instructions, but more than that, he could feel the glamour on it the way you feel the edge of a warm room. He walked through it at a normal pace, trunk rolling behind him, Hedwig's cage swaying in one hand, and emerged onto platform 9 3/4 on his own without any assistance whatsoever. The Hogwarts Express sat there in its red magnificence, already breathing steam, already crowded with families who were crying or not crying very well and owls and cats and toads and children in various states of excitement and terror. Harry stopped for a moment on the platform and just looked at it. He'd never seen it before. This life's 11-year-old self had no frame of reference for it at all. But the sight of it hit him somewhere real anyway, something that bypassed all 9 lives of accumulated cool and landed directly in whatever part of Harry Potter was purely, simply 11 and had grown up in a cupboard and had, despite all sensible instincts, wanted this. He breathed in. He breathed out. He loaded his trunk, settled Hedwig into the compartment he found near the middle of the train, quiet enough, not too isolated, and sat down by the window to watch the platform. He could see the Weasleys from here. The entire magnificent chaos of them, the red hair that made them visible from 50 yards, the harried mother who was somehow coordinating everything and everyone simultaneously, the twins who were already doing something they probably shouldn't be, the youngest boy trailing slightly behind his brothers with the particular energy of someone who was used to the position of youngest but one and had feelings about it. Ron Weasley. Harry watched him and felt something warm and uncomplicated. He'd had good friends in past lives. He knew what they felt like, the people whose loyalty was just in them, not calculated or conditional, just a fundamental quality of who they were. Ron had that. Even from here, even at 11, even trailing behind his brothers and looking slightly uncertain about everything, it was visible in the set of his shoulders. Harry had also noticed, in his reconnaissance of the platform, a girl standing with muggle-born nervousness and a book open in her hands, reading it on the platform while her parents hovered beside her. Brown hair, rather too much of it. Completely engrossed in what was clearly a textbook when everyone else around her was just absorbing the sheer reality of the magical world. He felt a fond, specific recognition for that kind of person. He'd been that person, in the life of Ibrahim al-Rashid, who had famously preferred his telescope to dinner parties and had needed to be physically removed from his observatory on more than one occasion. The train gave a long whistle. The platform erupted into the final, urgent goodbye. Harry watched parents embrace children, watched Molly Weasley kiss each red-haired child with an efficiency that suggested she had done this many times and intended to do it many more, and then the doors were closing and the platform was sliding away and the Hogwarts Express was moving, and Harry Potter was, finally, going to school. The compartment door slid open about 20 minutes into the journey, and Ron Weasley stuck his head in with the expression of someone who had checked 3 other compartments and found them all full of people he didn't particularly want to sit with. "Anywhere taken?" he asked. "Just me," Harry said. Ron came in, wrestled his trunk into the overhead rack with the aggressive determination of someone who refused to ask for help, and dropped into the seat across from Harry. He had a smudge of something, Harry suspected it might have been biscuit, on his nose, and he didn't seem to know about it, and Harry made the executive decision not to mention it because it was honestly quite endearing. "Ron Weasley," Ron said. "Harry Potter," Harry said. Ron's eyes went immediately to Harry's forehead. Then, with a visible and actually rather impressive act of will, he dragged them back up to Harry's eyes. "Sorry," he said. "My brothers kept going on about you on the platform and I promised myself I wouldn't." He gestured vaguely at the forehead area. "It's fine," Harry said. "What did your brothers say?" "Fred said you were probably brilliant. George said you were probably mental. Percy said you probably don't exist and the scar is a ministry legend." Ron paused. "Percy's head boy. He says that sort of thing. Which of them do you think is right?" Ron looked at him properly, which Harry appreciated, the direct, unfiltered assessment of a person who hadn't learned yet to be coy about his curiosity. "None of them," he said finally. "You look normal. That's probably the strangest thing." Harry smiled, and it felt genuine, which it was. "How many siblings do you have?" 6. "Well, 5 brothers and a sister. Ginny's not coming yet, she's still at home." Ron dug into his trunk and produced a parcel of sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, and then looked at it, and then at Harry, with the sudden self-conscious recognition that Harry had not produced any food whatsoever. "D'you want one? Mum packs about double what I can eat." "I'd love one," Harry said honestly. They ate for a while. Ron talked, which Harry discovered he liked, because Ron had the gift, rarer than it seemed, of talking about things he actually thought and felt rather than things he thought he should think and feel. He talked about his family home, the Burrow, about magic at home being completely normal in a way that made Harry quietly ache for what he'd missed. He talked about his brothers with a mixture of exasperation and genuine affection. He complained about always getting hand-me-down robes with the unself-conscious honesty of someone who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by that honesty, and then immediately looked as though he'd thought better of mentioning it. "I don't care about any of that," Harry said, which was true in every sense, this life, and also the life of a king, and also the life of a man who died owning 2 sets of clothes and a collection of astronomical instruments and had been, by his own reckoning, extraordinarily wealthy. "Yeah?" Ron said, not entirely believing him. "I grew up in a cupboard," Harry said. "Robes are robes." Ron stared at him. "A cupboard? Under the stairs." It was actually fine. Very compact. Harry offered this with such complete equanimity that Ron appeared to short-circuit slightly, caught between sympathy and laughter, and settled on a sort of startled grin. Did your relatives actually put you in a, they're very committed to normal," Harry said. "Anyway. What house do you think you'll be in?" The compartment door slid open again, and this time it was the brown-haired girl from the platform, now without the textbook but with the slightly urgent energy of someone on a specific mission. She looked at both of them and then said, with the brisk competence of a person who had decided to simply get things done, "Have either of you seen a toad?" A boy named Neville's lost his. Harry had, in fact, seen a toad. It had hopped into his compartment briefly about 10 minutes before Ron arrived, looked at him with deep amphibian judgment, and then departed back into the corridor. He said so. "Which direction?" she asked. "Left when it left," Harry said. "About 4 compartments down by now, probably, if it's been moving steadily. She nodded, and then seemed to notice that she hadn't introduced herself, and her expression shifted slightly, not embarrassed exactly, more like recalculating. "Hermione Granger," she said. "Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter." Her eyes didn't do the forehead flicker that Ron's had. They went wide in a different way, the recognition of someone who has read about a person and is now encountering them as a three-dimensional being, which is a slightly different experience. "I know who you are," she said. "I read about you in modern magical history. And the rise and fall of the dark arts." "And, what did they say?" Harry asked, genuinely curious. "That you defeated you-know-who as a baby," she said. "That nobody knows how." "Nobody knows how," Harry confirmed. "Including me. I was 1 year old." "Yes, but," she stopped. Looked at him more carefully, the way she might look at an equation that had come out with an unexpected answer. "You don't seem bothered by it." "Should I be?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "Most people would find it rather. I find it interesting," Harry said. "The mechanics of it. Something about my mother's death created a protection that destroyed him, or nearly destroyed him. That's not nothing. That's a specific and reproducible magical principle if anyone ever bothered to study it properly rather than just celebrating the outcome." There was a silence in the compartment that had a particular texture to it. Ron was looking at Harry with an expression that was trying to decide between impressed and uncertain. Hermione Granger was looking at him with an expression that was more complex, something he recognized from other lives, from Ibrahim's colleagues, from the alchemist's patrons. The look of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a person who speaks their language. "Sit down," Harry said. "There's plenty of room, and Neville will find his toad in compartment 7. She sat down. They found Neville, a round-faced boy with the expression of someone who apologized for his own existence approximately 12 times a day, already knocking on their compartment door 3 minutes later. Toad recovered, face flushed with embarrassed gratitude. Harry told him to come in. He did, with the cautious movement of someone not accustomed to being invited into things. The four of them sat in the compartment as England rolled past the windows, and something settled into the shape that it wanted to be. Harry watched them when they weren't watching him, which wasn't often, because they were all watching him with various degrees of subtle intensity, and felt, with the particular sharpness of someone who had lost many people he'd loved, the specific quality of what was forming. Ron, whose instincts were better than his confidence. Hermione, whose intelligence outpaced her self-awareness in exactly the way that would either make her extraordinary or insufferable depending on whether she learned to hold it lightly. Neville, who was afraid of almost everything, which Harry recognized from Edmund Blackwell's life as the signature quality of a person with genuine courage, because courage without fear wasn't courage at all. He didn't tell them any of this. He asked Neville about his toad. Trevor, it turned out, was a gift from an uncle who had perhaps not fully considered Neville's ability to manage living creatures, and learned that Neville had grown up without magic presenting itself, had been dropped from an upstairs window by his great-uncle Algy to see if it would shock the magic into him, and had only recently managed an accidental levitation. "What did it feel like?" Harry asked. Neville blinked. Nobody had ever apparently asked him this question. Like catching something that was falling," he said slowly. "Like I reached for it and it was there." "That's exactly right," Harry said. "Hold on to that feeling. That's the center of everything." Hermione was watching the exchange with the assessing quality of someone filing information. "Have you done much magic?" she asked Harry. "No formal training," Harry said. "I grew up with muggles. But I understand the theory." "From reading?" she asked. "Among other things," Harry said, which was perfectly true and somehow also the largest understatement he had ever made. The food trolley came around and Harry bought enough to share with all of them, partly because he had a genuine appetite and partly because Ron's sandwiches had run out and Neville looked like he hadn't had a proper meal since Yorkshire. The sweets were extraordinary to his palate, which was still partly adjusted to this body's 11 years of Petunia's carefully portioned meals. Bertie Bott's every flavor beans turned out to include a flavor that tasted precisely like a particular fermented fish paste he'd encountered in a previous life and which he had not missed at all. He ate it anyway. He was not going to be defeated by a jelly bean. They passed through the rolling countryside of the Scottish Highlands as afternoon came on, the light going gold and horizontal, and the four of them had moved past the stage of introductions and were now simply talking the way people sometimes did when the combination of who they were and the particular light at the particular time created a kind of ease that hadn't been there an hour before. Ron was explaining Quidditch with the evangelical enthusiasm of someone who had never doubted that the game was inherently the most important thing in the world and was now bewildered to meet people who didn't know it. Hermione was asking precise, slightly annoying questions about rule enforcement and scoring mathematics that Ron was answering with magnificent vagueness. Neville was watching Harry. Harry noticed. He met Neville's eyes and raised an eyebrow. "You're not what I expected," Neville said quietly, under Ron and Hermione's ongoing Quidditch disagreement. "What did you expect?" Neville thought about it honestly, which Harry appreciated. "I don't know. Famous. More, like you knew you were famous." "Do I seem like I don't?" "You seem like it doesn't matter to you. Like, at all." Harry considered his answer. "What you are," he said, "and what people say you are, those are almost never the same thing. I'd rather just be what I actually am." Neville was quiet for a moment. "What are you, then?" Harry smiled, and for a moment it was a smile with 9 other lifetimes behind it, and it must have shown in some way he hadn't intended, because Neville's eyes went slightly wider, but then Harry let it settle into something simpler and said, "Someone who's looking forward to learning things." "Same as you." Neville did not look entirely convinced by this, but he nodded, and something in his shoulders came down about an inch. When they changed into their robes, Harry did so with the brisk efficiency of someone who had dressed in armor, in silk court robes, in battlefield conditions, in total darkness. The Hogwarts uniform presented no particular challenge. He noticed Draco Malfoy in the corridor, hard to miss, the confident to arrogant set of his shoulders, the 2 larger boys flanking him, the expression of someone who had grown up being told that the world was organized into a hierarchy and he was near the top of it. Malfoy looked at Harry with the bright, proprietary interest of someone who has a specific social expectation of this encounter. "Harry Potter," he said. "Draco Malfoy," Harry said, because he knew the name from every piece of cultural briefing that the magical world had managed to press on him in his brief time having the memories to process it. Pure-blood families. The war. The alliances. Malfoy looked briefly startled, then pleased, then recalibrated back to smooth. "You know who I am." "I know a lot of things," Harry said, pleasantly. "Nice to meet you." He continued down the corridor. He heard Malfoy say something behind him, but he let it go, because he had discovered a long time ago, specifically in the court of a Chinese empress, that not taking the bait offered by people testing your reactions was both more powerful and more enjoyable than taking it. The train was slowing. Through the window, the darkness of Scotland was now being cut by something, a glow, distant and then not distant, and then the castle. Harry had seen magnificent things. He had seen Rome at the height of its power, and the Saharan stars so thick you could navigate by them as if they were a map, and Japanese mountains in autumn with their red and gold, and the moment at dawn over the French countryside when the light came before the sun did. He had seen things that were beautiful and things that were terrible and a few things that were both. Hogwarts at night, lit up across the lake, was something else. It was alive in a way that buildings weren't supposed to be. He could feel it from here. The magic of it was an old, layered thing, not the clean-focused magic of a spell but something more like what the earth felt like in places where many people had cared deeply for a long time. He felt it the way his Victorian occultist life had taught him to feel magical architecture, and what he felt made the hairs on his arms stand up. The castle knew its own. Around him in the boats, the other first-years were experiencing their first view of Hogwarts and processing it in various ways, some silently, some not silently at all, Neville gripping the side of the boat with both hands while Trevor croaked steadily from his pocket. Ron was staring with the expression of someone seeing something they'd heard about all their lives and finding that the reality of it was somehow bigger than the description. Hermione had tears on her face, which she appeared entirely unaware of. Harry sat in the boat and felt the lake under them and the castle ahead and the cold Scottish air on his face, and let himself, completely, want this. All of it. The school, the magic, the people, the years ahead of him that were going to be difficult and strange and full of someone else's plans for him that he intended to dismantle with methodical patience. He wanted it all. "You're smiling," Ron said, from beside him in the boat. "It's beautiful," Harry said. "Yeah," Ron agreed, and looked back at the castle, and for a moment they were just two 11-year-olds going to school. They came through the great doors still damp from the crossing, and a stern-faced woman with a tartan cloak and the particular quality of efficient authority that Harry associated with the best generals he'd known looked at them all and said, with no preamble whatsoever, "Welcome to Hogwarts." She told them about the houses with the brisk confidence of someone who had said this many times and still meant every word of it. She told them about the house points. She told them about the sorting. Harry listened and looked at the stone walls and felt the magic moving in them the way water moves in pipes, and thought, "This is the best school I have ever attended, and I have attended 9. A group of ghosts came through the wall and caused the predictable reaction among the first years, and Harry watched them with genuine professional interest. The magical theory of ghosts was something Edmund Blackwell had strong opinions about, and the empirical reality of them was being filed away rapidly. Then McGonagall led them into the Great Hall. The ceiling. He'd known about it, the way you knew about things from descriptions, but there was something about the actual experience of walking under a ceiling that reflected the real sky, the real cloud moving, star appearing, authentically Scottish September sky, that made every description feel like a pencil sketch of a painting. Around him, everyone was looking up. Harry looked up, and then looked level, and took in the hall, the 4 long house tables, the hundreds of older students already seated and watching the first years file in, the staff table at the front where a dozen adults were arranged with the complex body language of people who had been colleagues for decades. He found Dumbledore immediately. It wasn't difficult. The man had a presence like a physical force, the specific gravity of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for a very long time. Long silver hair, half-moon spectacles, an expression of benevolent pleasure that Harry read, with all the political instinct of a Roman general and a Chinese empress and a French revolutionary, as something carefully curated. He was watching the first years come in with that warm, grandfather's gaze, and it swept over them one by one, and when it reached Harry there was a microsecond of something, calculation, or hope, or the specific quality of a chess player who has just located the piece they've been planning around. Harry met his eyes and smiled pleasantly and looked away. He felt, very distantly, like the game had just begun. Quirrell was also at the staff table, wearing a ridiculous purple turban and the expression of a man with a splitting headache, which, Harry supposed, made complete sense given the situation. He examined him with the particular attention of Edmund Blackwell, who had fought a genuine dark entity and knew what possession looked and felt like, and confirmed what he'd suspected, yes. There was something wrong at the back of Quirrell's head that had nothing to do with the turban. Something that felt old and cold and very, very hungry. He filed it. He would deal with it in due course, and on his own terms. The sorting hat, when McGonagall placed it on the stool, opened its brim and sang. Harry listened to the whole song with more genuine attention than anyone else in the hall, because he'd been a poet in one life and a musician in passing in 2 others, and the hat's composition was genuinely impressive. The internal rhyme structure was doing something clever in the 3rd verse that he appreciated. They called them up alphabetically. Harry watched his classmates get sorted, noting the faces, the hesitations, the hat's deliberation. He saw Hermione get Gryffindor and saw her whole body practically vibrate with the relief of belonging somewhere. He saw Neville approach the stool with the expression of a man walking to the gallows, and then the hat call Gryffindor, and saw Neville's face do something extraordinary and unguarded. "Potter, Harry." The hall did what he'd expected it to do, went quiet in a specific, charged way. Whispers cycling like current. He walked up the center aisle with the unhurried ease of a man who had walked into many rooms where everyone was watching him and had long since stopped finding it disconcerting. He sat on the stool. McGonagall placed the hat on his head. It fell down over his eyes, which was undignified, and then the hat said, inside his head with the air of someone who had just sat down in a chair and found it considerably more interesting than expected, "Well, I've sorted 11,000 students," it said, "and I have never." "Take your time," Harry said, in his head. "You, how many?" The hat appeared to be, in its metaphysical way, flipping through pages. 9. Yes. 9 complete lifetimes. And you're 11. Also yes. That is not, the hat said, with what might have been the mental equivalent of sitting down heavily, how this works. "I'm open to discussion about the mechanism," Harry said pleasantly, "but perhaps we could sort first and discuss magical theory of soul transmission later. You'd be Gryffindor in this life, obviously. The courage isn't performance with you, it's structural. But you've also got the mind of a Ravenclaw, the loyalty architecture of a Hufflepuff, and I'm seeing at least 2 lifetimes where you'd have been a Slytherin without question. What would you recommend?" Harry asked, which was a question the hat had apparently never been asked, because it went briefly silent. "What do you want?" Harry thought about it genuinely. About what this life needed. About the shape of what was coming. About Hermione and Ron and Neville, already at the Gryffindor table, and about the fact that he didn't choose his friendships based on strategy, he chose them based on who those people actually were. "Where they are," Harry said. "Gryffindor," the hat said, in a tone that conveyed, quietly, that it was going to be thinking about this for a while. "Gryffindor," it shouted. The Gryffindor table erupted. The hall buzzed. Dumbledore was watching with the particular expression of a man whose piece has landed exactly on the square he'd planned, and Harry slid into his seat between Ron and Neville and picked up his fork and thought, "Right. Good. Let's begin." Chapter 2, The Castle Knows Its Own. The Great Hall smelled like roast chicken and magic. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table between Ron and Neville, with Hermione across from him, and ate his first real meal of the day with the focused appreciation of someone who had, in various lifetimes, experienced both genuine feasts and genuine famine, and had therefore never fully lost the ability to be grateful for a plate of food that was hot and well seasoned. Around him the hall was noise and light and the particular chaos of several hundred people all being happy at the same time, which was its own kind of weather. Ron was eating with the dedicated intensity of a person communing with something sacred. Neville was looking around the hall with wide eyes, still processing the fact that the hat had put him in Gryffindor, which appeared to have upended several of his foundational assumptions about himself. Hermione was dividing her attention between her food and a mental cataloguing of the hall that Harry could practically watch happening on her face, the systematic cross-referencing of everything she'd read against everything she could actually see. "The ceiling really does show the actual sky," she said. "I thought it might be a reasonable approximation, but look, there's Cassiopeia, right where it should be." "My dad showed me how to find that one," Ron said, through a mouthful of chicken. "And Orion. Those are the only 2 he knows." He paused. "He knows more about Muggle things than stars. He's got a rubber duck collection." "A rubber duck collection," Hermione repeated. 14 of them," Ron said, with the tone of a man who had made peace with this fact a long time ago. Harry was watching the staff table. Not obviously, he was eating, he was present in the conversation, he laughed at the right moments, but underneath it, the part of him that was Louis Milius the political strategist was running a quiet parallel process, cataloging the adults who would define the perimeter of his world for the next 7 years. McGonagall was watching the first years with the expression of a person who was genuinely invested in their welfare and had therefore developed a highly efficient system for concealing it, because showing it too openly would compromise the authority structure she'd spent 30 years building. He liked her immediately, in the specific way he'd liked the best military commanders he'd served under, the ones whose strictness came from standards rather than power. Flitwick was small and bright-eyed and was having an animated conversation with the history of magic professor that involved considerable hand-waving. There was a pure, uncomplicated love of magic in him that was visible from across the hall. Snape was not watching the first years. He was watching Harry, with the particular intensity of a man working through a very difficult problem, and he looked away the moment Harry's gaze moved toward him, which told Harry that Snape was precisely as perceptive as his reputation suggested, because he'd timed the look away perfectly. Just barely too late, though. Harry had already seen what he needed to see. Snape's expression, before it shuddered, hadn't been the hostility Harry might have expected from the cultural mythology around their relationship. It had been something more complicated. Grief and assessment, and something that might have been, in a face less controlled, a flinching. He sees James, Harry thought. And he hates it. But there's something else too, he's looking for something. Looking to see if the boy is worth the debts he's apparently decided to pay. He filed it. Not with judgment, with information. He'd known many people in his lives who carried old loves and old wounds like armor, and the key with them was never what they said. It was always what they couldn't stop looking at. Dumbledore, at the center of the staff table, presided over the meal with the particular grace of someone who had been performing genial authority for so long that the performance and the person had become almost indistinguishable. He told them about the forest being forbidden, about the caretaker Filch, about the third-floor corridor, with a twinkle in his eye that, Harry thought, was doing a lot of work. The twinkle was supposed to communicate benevolent eccentricity, the lovable grandfather who couldn't quite keep his school entirely under control. What it actually communicated, if you had 9 lifetimes of reading powerful people's performances, was, here is something dangerous that I am not going to explain, and I am framing it as a small thing so that telling you about it counts as warning you. Harry ate his pudding and made a note. The first years were led to Gryffindor Tower by Percy Weasley, who did it with the magnificent seriousness of a person who believed deeply that someone had to be serious about things or the world would fall apart, and was prepared to be that someone at every available opportunity. Harry found him genuinely charming in this, the way he found deeply committed people charming regardless of what they were committed to. Percy's commitment was to order and achievement, and he narrated the route to the tower with the brisk clarity of a military briefing. Fat lady's the password guardian, Percy was explaining, and you will change the password, it's Caput Draconis currently, and if you forget it, you sleep in the corridor, which I will tell you now is not something I've ever had occasion to do because I have an excellent memory. Has anyone ever actually slept in the corridor? Ron muttered, beside Harry. Yes, Harry said. Ron looked at him. How do you know that? I'm guessing, Harry said, which was not entirely false. He was extrapolating from the general principles of institutional life, which he knew extremely well. The portrait of the fat lady swung open, and Gryffindor Tower was warm. That was the thing about it that hit him first. Not warm like someone had turned up the heating, but warm like a place that had been lived in and loved for a long time. Stone walls and deep-set windows and furniture that had been replaced several times over the centuries but which had been chosen by people who wanted their students to be comfortable in it. The fire in the common room was large and the chairs around it were battered and there were notice boards covered in announcements and a general feeling of productive chaos. Harry stood in the middle of it and felt, with some surprise, something that was almost domestic. He'd had homes in other lives. He'd had a palace and a scholar's tower and a general's tent and a small flat in Delhi with a broken window he'd kept meaning to fix. He'd had places that were his. He'd had, in this life, a cupboard. The cupboard had been shelter, which was not the same thing. But this room, which was not his and belonged to hundreds of students across decades, somehow had the quality of home in a way that the cupboard never had. He let himself feel it without making it into something bigger than it was. Then he went to bed. He lay in the four-poster bed, he was 11 and sleeping in a four-poster bed, which was objectively an upgrade from nearly every situation he'd found himself in, and looked up at the canopy in the dark and listened to the sounds of 5 other first-year boys settling in around him. Ron muttering something in his sleep already, which suggested he dropped off with the enviable speed of the untroubled. Neville's very careful, quiet breathing that meant he was awake and trying not to bother anyone. Dean and Seamus's low voices, already becoming friends with the easy speed of people who had sat next to each other on the train and found the combination worked. Harry stared at the canopy and assembled everything he knew. He was at Hogwarts. Voldemort was in the building, wearing Quirrell. Dumbledore had something concealed in the third-floor corridor, the Philosopher's Stone, he knew, because Edmund Blackwell had known Nicholas Flamel, and the stone was not a rumor but a real, extraordinary piece of alchemical work, and he knew what it could do, and he also knew that having it here was a liability specifically because Voldemort would know it was here. There were 7 years of magical education ahead of him, with the curriculum as it stood being both impressive in its breadth and deeply inadequate in its depth. There were people in this castle who would try to use him, some with malice, some with the most genuine good intentions in the world, and he intended to let none of them succeed. What he wanted, he thought in the dark, what he actually wanted from this life, was simpler than any of that. He wanted to learn. He wanted to master the magic that had flickered to the surface in Giacomo's life and grown through Edmund's and was now, in this body that was somehow both his first proper magical body and his 10th life, more present and more powerful than anything he'd felt before. He wanted to understand it, not just use it, but understand it the way Ibrahim had understood the stars, from first principles, with rigor and joy. He wanted the friendships that were forming. Ron and Neville and Hermione were people he'd chosen, in the way that mattered, freely, with full knowledge of who he was choosing. He wanted to watch them become who they could be. He wanted, when Voldemort came back properly, and he would come back properly, to be ready. Not because anyone had handed him a destiny. Because he'd decided, with the full weight of 9 lifetimes of understanding what happened when good people weren't ready, that he intended to be prepared this time. He closed his eyes. He slept. He dreamed, briefly, of a dusty road in 1947 and Rajan Mehta's hands, which had been healers' hands, and the last thing they'd held was a letter he'd written that he knew he wouldn't live to post. He woke feeling clear. The first morning at Hogwarts began with the chaos of 11-year-olds discovering timetables and trying to find classrooms in a building that rearranged its staircases periodically, which was a design feature that made considerably more sense if you thought about it as a magical building that was partly alive and partly bored, rather than as a school with sensible navigation. Harry moved through it with the orientation instincts of several lifetimes and a memory that retained exactly where he'd been told each classroom was, and arrived at every class with time to spare. Herbology with Professor Sprout was first, practical, grounded, a woman who loved her plants with the uncomplicated wholeness of someone who'd found their thing and never let it go. Harry had no particular lifetimes of specific herbological experience, but Giacomo the alchemist had worked extensively with magical plants, and the theory was in him, and it meant that when they were handling their first herbology specimens, his technique was exact in a way that made Sprout glance at him twice. He didn't perform it. He didn't make it visible. He just did the work correctly. Then transfiguration, which was McGonagall's domain, and which was, Harry thought, sitting down and running the magical theory through his mind, the most philosophically interesting branch of magic on the curriculum. The idea that matter was not fixed, that form was a negotiation rather than a fact, that the universe at a magical level had some consent to being differently shaped, he found it extraordinary. He found it so interesting that when McGonagall transformed her desk into a pig and back again, he actually sat forward. McGonagall noticed. Her eyes moved to him briefly, then away. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she said, moving to the front of the class with the precision of someone who had delivered this speech many times but had not allowed it to become rote. Anyone who messes around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. She was, Harry thought, excellent. The practical work was the match-into-needle exercise. Harry picked up his wand, holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, the wand that had chosen him at Ollivander's with an energy that felt, Ollivander had said in a hushed voice, like a recognition, and looked at the match. He thought about the nature of a needle. Not the look of it, but the concept, the purpose of sharp, the purpose of thin, the specific material honesty of metal versus wood. He thought about transfiguration not as forcing the match into a different shape, but as asking the match to be what it was already close to being. He touched the wand to the match. It became a needle. Clean, complete, perfect. The head was correct. The eye was the right diameter. It was, in every technical sense, a needle. McGonagall was beside him before he'd finished registering that it had worked. She picked it up, examined it, held it up to the light from the window, and set it back on the desk. The expression on her face was the very specific expression of a professional encountering something that requires recalibration, which she was doing internally with impressive speed. "Good," she said, and moved on. Hermione had almost managed hers. Ron's was still a match, though it looked vaguely metallic in a way that suggested it was thinking about it. Neville's had turned grey, which McGonagall said was a good start. Harry caught Hermione's eye across the table. She looked from his needle to his face with an expression that was part impressed and part assessing and part something else, the specific look of a very competitive person recalibrating their competition. He smiled at her. She returned it, slightly warily. They had their first flying lesson later that week, and that was something else entirely. The broomstick leapt into his hand on command, which it did for roughly half the class. Neville's didn't move at all until his second attempt, and then it smacked him in the face, which was not ideal. Harry mounted his broom and felt the ground leave his feet and felt, with the sudden complete certainty of a body that had been waiting for this, that flying was where this particular life's physical joy was going to live. He'd ridden horses. He'd sailed. He'd stood at the prow of a ship in a storm that should have killed him and felt something very similar to this, the sensation of being part of a moving thing, the world reorganizing itself into something three-dimensional and fast and exhilarating. But this was different because this was magic, and the broom was responding to him not mechanically but sympathetically, and the air at 30 feet above the ground tasted like nothing else. Madame Hooch's instructions were for them to rise, hover, and descend. Harry rose, hovered, and then, because Kofi Asante had never done anything halfway when he could do it properly, and neither, it turned out, had Harry Potter, leaned into a long, banking turn about 40 feet up that was completely unnecessary and thoroughly enjoyable. Madame Hooch looked up at him with her hawk-yellow eyes. He descended, landed, and rejoined the class, and she looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality of someone who taught a physical skill and had just encountered someone who had it at a cellular level. "Controlled?" she said. "Completely," Harry said. She nodded once, which from a woman of her economy of expression was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Neville's broom, in the end, shot upward violently, deposited Neville at a terrifying height, and came back down without him. Harry had already moved before Hooch had finished shouting, not with a broom, just on the ground, getting his positioning right for Neville to land on, which Neville did, painfully but not catastrophically, with Harry breaking most of the impact. Madame Hooch took Neville to the hospital wing. Draco Malfoy picked up the Remembrall that had fallen with Neville and held it up with a smile that was doing several unpleasant things at once. Harry watched him. The thing about Draco Malfoy, and Harry had spent a fair amount of his accumulated political experience thinking about people like Draco Malfoy, because courts were full of them, and armies, and revolutionary committees, was that he wasn't actually cruel in the way that the truly dangerous ones were. He was performing a version of himself that his upbringing had written for him, and he was performing it with conviction because he'd never been given a serious reason to question it. He needed an audience and a hierarchy. He needed someone to be above and someone to be below. What he didn't know how to handle, yet, was someone who simply didn't participate in the hierarchy at all. "I'll take that," Harry said. Malfoy turned. His two companions shifted slightly, the weight redistribution of people preparing for a confrontation. "Come and get it, then," Malfoy said. Harry walked over to him, stopped at normal conversational distance, and held out his hand. Not aggressively. Not performatively. Just a hand, held out, waiting. Malfoy had clearly expected either confrontation or backing down. He didn't have a ready response for someone who was simply standing calmly in front of him with an outstretched hand and an expression of complete patience. "You don't want to make an enemy of me," Malfoy said, which was a line he'd clearly prepared for some version of this moment. "I don't want to make an enemy of anyone," Harry said honestly. "But I'm also not going to leave without the Remembrall, so we can stand here as long as you need to." Crabbe and Goyle shifted again. Harry didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Malfoy with the relaxed, unhurried attention of a swordmaster who was not preparing to fight and was also not the slightest bit worried about having to. Something moved in Malfoy's face, not quite uncertainty, not quite interest. Something in between. He dropped the Remembrall into Harry's hand with a flip of his fingers that was designed to look like he'd decided it wasn't worth his time, rather than that he hadn't found the reaction he was looking for. "Your loss, Potter," he said. "Possibly," Harry agreed, and pocketed the Remembrall. He returned it to Neville in the hospital wing, where Neville was sitting on a white bed with his wrist in a sling and a very small cup of something Madame Pomfrey had given him. Neville looked at the Remembrall and then at Harry with the specific expression of someone who has been the subject of a quiet, uncomplicated act of loyalty and doesn't entirely know what to do with it. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know," Harry said. "How's the wrist?" "Fine. She says it'll be healed by dinner." He paused. "Malfoy's going to hate you now." "He already wasn't sure what to do with me," Harry said. "That's more interesting than him hating me." Neville looked at him sideways. "You're weird," he said, and it came out with the warm wary quality of someone who was beginning to think that weird might be exactly what they needed. "So I've been told," Harry said, and sat down in the visitor's chair. Charms was Flitwick's classroom, which smelled like parchment and something sweet, and Flitwick himself was perched on a pile of books that let him see over his desk, and he called Harry's name during the register and fell off his pile, which Harry had been quietly expecting based on Ron's advance warning and which he watched with genuine warmth rather than amusement. He liked Flitwick immediately. There was no performance in him, no institutional positioning, just a man who found magic delightful and wanted other people to find it delightful too, and whose method of teaching was essentially just infectious enthusiasm with very good technical grounding underneath. History of Magic was Binns, who was a ghost, who had apparently died during a lesson and simply kept teaching, which was either the most committed thing Harry had ever heard of or the most tragic depending on your perspective. The class was generally soporific. Harry used the time to think about magical theory, which Binns's presence made thematically appropriate. Defense against the dark arts was last on the Thursday timetable, and that was where Harry had his first direct encounter with the particular wrongness of Professor Quirrell. It wasn't obvious. If you didn't know to look for it, and most 11-year-olds wouldn't, it read as nervousness, the specific stuttering anxiety of a man who was perhaps not well suited to his position. The turban. The faint smell of garlic, which was almost funny in its fairy tale literalness. The way he wouldn't quite meet anyone's eyes for longer than a moment. What Harry felt was something else. It was the thing Edmund Blackwell had spent 20 years learning to recognize, the displaced quality of a soul that was sharing its container with something that wasn't it. Like two flames in one lamp. The second flame ran cold. Harry sat in the front row, which he'd been doing in every class because he was not going to pretend he didn't want to be there, and watched Quirrell explain the theory of defensive counterjinxes with the patient, clinical attention of someone cataloging symptoms. Voldemort was in there. Reduced, fragmented, barely coherent as a separate consciousness, not Voldemort the Dark Lord but the remnant of one, clinging to life with the specific tenacity of something that had made itself unable to die properly. It was cold, and old, and it knew Harry was here. He could feel that awareness like pressure at the back of his neck. He didn't react to it. He took notes on the counterjinx theory, which was reasonably solid, and when Quirrell asked if there were questions, Harry asked a precise technical question about the theoretical basis of the shield charm that sent Quirrell into a visible 5-second freeze before he answered, haltingly, correctly. Harry thanked him and wrote down the answer. After class, Walking with Ron toward the Great Hall for lunch, Ron said, "He's a bit odd, isn't he?" "Quirrell." "A bit," Harry agreed. "Fred and George say he was fine before he took the year off. Went to study vampires in Romania or something and came back like that." He paused. "Do you think it's the turban?" "The turban is definitely not helping," Harry said. Ron laughed, and they went to lunch. The letter from Dumbledore arrived on a Friday evening, carried by a school owl that landed on Harry's shoulder in the common room with the slightly self-important manner of an owl on official business. Harry untied it, opened it, and read it without changing expression. "Dear Harry, I wonder if you might find time this weekend to visit an old man for tea? I find the beginning of term is an excellent time to get to know our new students, and I make a particular point of it for those who might, for various reasons, benefit from a guiding hand in navigating the magical world. My office is on the 3rd floor, the gargoyle guards the entrance. The password is Sherbet Lemon. Yours most sincerely, Albus Dumbledore." Ron, who had been reading upside down with the completely unashamed curiosity of someone who didn't consider other people's letters private unless explicitly told so, said, "Are you going to go?" "Of course," Harry said. "He wants to look you over," Ron said, with the practical insight of someone who had grown up around magic and power structures. "Dad says Dumbledore always has a reason for everything he does." "Your dad's right," Harry said, folding the letter. "But having a reason for something and being right about it are two different things." Ron considered this. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's invited me for tea," Harry said. "So I'll go for tea." Sunday morning, Harry knocked on the door of Dumbledore's office, and it swung open. The office was extraordinary. Not because of its scale, though it was large, but because of its density. Centuries of accumulated objects, portraits, instruments, books, each one carrying a specific gravity of history. The portraits of former headmasters watched him come in with the assessing quality of people who had been watching headmasters for a long time and had opinions. The Sorting Hat sat on its shelf and, Harry thought, was paying attention. Fawkes the Phoenix was on his perch, and he was the most beautiful living thing Harry had seen in this life, which was saying something. The bird looked at Harry with eyes that were both ancient and cheerful in equal measure, ruffled its feathers once in greeting, and subsided. Harry sat in the chair across from Dumbledore's desk. Dumbledore was standing at a small table near the window with a teapot and 2 cups, and he moved to his chair with the unhurried grace of a man who understood that controlling the pace of a room was the first thing you established in any meeting. He poured tea with the serene confidence of a host. "Lemon drop?" he said, offering the bowl. "No, thank you," Harry said. Dumbledore smiled. The twinkle was present at close range, considerably more powerful than it had been across the Great Hall. It was very well crafted, Harry thought. It communicated so many things simultaneously: warmth, wisdom, slight amusement, invitation to trust. He had known an empress whose smile had been a similarly engineered instrument, and he'd loved her for it while also never being fooled by it. "How are you finding Hogwarts, Harry?" Dumbledore said. "Remarkable," Harry said honestly. "The magic in the building is extraordinary. I've never been in a structure that was alive in quite that way." Dumbledore's eyebrows rose very slightly, just the fraction of a centimeter that suggested this wasn't the answer he'd expected. He covered it beautifully. "It is rather special. Hogwarts has a way of welcoming those who belong to it." He cradled his teacup. "I imagine the wizarding world is quite different from life with your aunt and uncle." "Yes," Harry said. "It must be a great deal to absorb," Dumbledore said, and there it was, the opening note of the composition he was beginning to play. "You are overwhelmed. You are a child in a new world. You need guidance." "Not particularly," Harry said pleasantly. "I've always been a quick study." "Yes, indeed." Dumbledore studied him, and now the twinkle was doing something more careful. "Professor McGonagall speaks very highly of your early work. She's an excellent teacher." "They all are." Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice shifted very slightly, still warm, but with a depth to it, a gravity that he deployed sparingly and with precision. I want you to know that I am here for you. Not merely as your headmaster. If there is anything you need, questions about your parents, about your history, about anything at all, my door is open. Harry looked at him. He let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to, long enough that it wasn't a reflexive response, short enough that it wasn't a challenge. That's very kind, he said. I do have one question. Dumbledore leaned forward very slightly. Of course. How did my mother's sacrifice create a blood protection? Harry asked. The specific magical mechanics. I've been trying to work it out, but the literature I've found so far only describes the outcome, not the principle. The silence that followed was a different quality than the one before it. Dumbledore was, Harry could see, genuinely recalibrating. He had come into this meeting with a specific emotional architecture, the overwhelmed, grateful orphan, the child who needed a guide, and he was encountering something that didn't fit any of its rooms. That, Dumbledore said carefully, is a very sophisticated question. It's a very important one, Harry said. If the principle is understood, it could be applied defensively in other contexts. Lives could be saved by it. The magic of love and sacrifice is, Dumbledore paused, choosing his words. Ancient. Not fully understood, even by me. But you have a theory, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't built a category for. The warmth didn't leave his face, but behind it something was working very hard. I do, he said. I'd love to hear it sometime, Harry said. When you think I'm ready for it, of course. He said it without irony. With perfect, genuine respect. And he watched Dumbledore absorb the fact that the boy sitting across from him had just politely, completely, and without aggression told him that he understood a game was being played. You are, Dumbledore said slowly, a remarkable young man. I had a good teacher, Harry said, which was technically true of several lifetimes. Thank you for the tea. He stood. He had timed it correctly, ending the meeting himself, naturally, before Dumbledore had finished his assessment, which left the conversation incomplete in Dumbledore's mind rather than concluded on his terms. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. The sherbet lemon, he said. Was that always the password, or did you change it when you invited me? Dumbledore's expression was unreadable. Harry smiled at him and left. He walked back through the castle in the Sunday morning quiet, his footsteps on the stone floors a steady rhythm. The portraits watched him pass. He nodded to a medieval knight who had been watching him with what might have been professional respect since he'd first walked this corridor. The castle's magic moved around him like current around a stone, and he put his hand flat against the wall as he walked and felt it, warm and deep and very old. Something in the castle responded. He felt it, a faint, almost subliminal shift in the quality of the air around him, like a house recognizing a familiar footstep. Hello, he said quietly, to the wall, to the castle. The warmth intensified for just a moment. Then settled. He went back to the common room, where Ron was attempting to play wizard chess with himself, which was going poorly because the pieces kept arguing with each other. Hermione was at the table by the window with 3 books open and a piece of parchment covered in notes. Neville was trying to remember the names of 12 specific magical plants and periodically asking either of them for help, which Ron was providing with wild inaccuracy and Hermione was providing with precision but decreasing patience. Harry sat down beside Ron and looked at the chessboard. You're about to lose, he said. I know, Ron said. I keep telling the knight to go there, he pointed, and he keeps going here, he pointed somewhere else, because apparently he has opinions about the bishop's opening strategy. Harry looked at the board properly, running through it with the strategic sense of a general and the chess theory of several lifetimes. Move the rook first, he said. Your knight's right, the bishop opening is weak. If you establish the rook's diagonal, the knight can follow. Ron stared at him. You play chess? A bit, Harry said. He played a bit, as it turned out, in the sense that he had played for 40 years in one life with some of the finest players in Japan, and what followed was approximately 8 minutes of Ron winning comprehensively, which he hadn't expected and which made him laugh with the surprised, genuine delight of someone who is used to winning but more used to having to work for it. That's the best game I've had all week, Ron said. Even counting Fred and George. Your instincts are very good, Harry said honestly. Your board vision is excellent. You second-guess yourself too much. Ron looked slightly startled to receive this as a genuine observation rather than flattery. He turned it over for a moment, checked it against his own experience, and accepted it. Yeah, he said. I do. Stop that, Harry said. Right, Ron said. Hermione looked up from her books. Harry, she said, with the tone of someone who has been building toward a question for some time and has finally decided to ask it. How did you do the transfiguration exercise that quickly? On the first attempt? Natural aptitude, Harry said. Nobody has that much natural aptitude on their first, Hermione. He said it gently, not dismissively. I grew up knowing I was magical and not being allowed to do anything about it. I thought about it constantly. I theorized about it. 11 years of theory and no practical work means that when the practical work starts, he shrugged. The theory does a lot of the heavy lifting. She stared at him, not entirely satisfied, running it through her considerable internal logic engine and finding that while it didn't explain everything, it explained enough to file and move on from. All right, she said. But if you know the theory, can you explain why the switching spell we're going to cover in week 4 is more practically complex than the basic transfiguration even though the theoretical framework seems simpler? Because I've been reading ahead and it doesn't. The theory is simpler because it's a derivative application, Harry said, putting his feet up on a nearby footstool and lacing his fingers behind his head. You're using a pre-established transfiguration channel rather than opening a new one. But derivative applications require the channel to be held open for longer, which means sustained intent rather than focused intent, and sustained intent is a different cognitive skill. It's harder to maintain than to initiate. Hermione stared at him with the expression of someone who has just heard their own intuition explained back to them with precise language. Ron looked between them. Are you two going to talk about magic like this all year? Yes, Harry and Hermione said, simultaneously. Ron sighed. Fine, he said. Neville, do you want to learn chess? I'll probably be terrible at it, Neville said. Brilliant, Ron said. Set them up. Harry watched Neville begin arranging the chess pieces, carefully, methodically, with the concentration of someone determined to do even a small thing correctly, and felt the common room around him with its firelight and its noise and its battered furniture, and thought about how the last several lifetimes had all ended in varying degrees of incompleteness. Things unfinished. People left. Not this time. He was done with incomplete. He pulled out his charms textbook and began reading the section on the theory of the levitation charm, annotating in the margins in a handwriting that was 11-year-old Harry's but with marginal notes that would have made Flitwick look twice, and the fire crackled, and outside the tower window September deepened into an early Hogwarts evening and the stars came out over Scotland. And if Cassiopeia was exactly where Hermione had said it should be, well, some things, at least, were exactly where they were supposed to be. Chapter 3, What the Library Remembers. The library smelled like every library Harry had ever loved. That was 9 libraries, technically, from the great columned collection in Rome that had smelled of papyrus and lamp oil, to the cool stone archive in Timbuktu where Ibrahim had spent 3 years transcribing star charts, to Edmund Blackwell's private library in a crumbling Hampshire house that had smelled like mildew and something slightly burnt and had contained books that occasionally bit back. Each one had had its own specific perfume of paper and age and accumulated human thought, and Hogwarts library carried all of those memories at once and added something else, the specific sharp sweet scent of magical ink, which had a quality no Muggle library could replicate. Like standing next to lightning before it struck. Harry came here every evening after dinner. Not because anyone expected him to. If anything, the general expectation from his classmates was that Harry Potter was talented in a way that didn't require effort, which was a misreading he was happy to leave alone for now, but because there was work to do and this was where the tools were. Madame Pants ran her library with the focused intensity of a person who understood that books were living things and that their care was not a minor responsibility. She had watched Harry arrive for the fourth consecutive evening with the wary assessment of a woman whose domain was frequently abused by children, and then watched him work with a focus and efficiency that had moved him, over a week, from suspect to tolerated to something approaching respect. She had, on the third day, directed him to the restricted section without him asking, purely on the basis that the book he was looking for, a tertiary theoretical text on the principles of transfiguration that the standard curriculum didn't reach until fifth year, was shelved there for reasons that were more administrative than genuinely restrictive. She hadn't commented on this. Neither had he. It was an understanding between professionals. Tonight he had 4 books open and a parchment grid of his own devising spread across the table. The grid was a mapping system he'd developed, Kofi Asante's battle planning methodology adapted for magical theory, that let him track the relationships between different branches of spell work. Most students learned magic the way you learned a collection of facts. Harry was learning the grammar of it. The underlying structure that meant you could derive what you didn't know from what you did. The charms to transfiguration axis was clear. The charms to potions axis was interesting. Potions was, at its core, a chemistry of magical intention, and the relationship between ambient spellwork and active brewing was underexplored in the literature he'd found so far. The defense to offensive magic axis was one most students thought was straightforward but was actually deeply theoretical if you looked at where a shield charm was storing the energy it deflected, because it wasn't disappearing. Energy didn't disappear. That was physics. That was also magic, if you understood it correctly. What is that? Hermione said, sliding into the chair beside him and looking at the grid. A map, he said. She looked at it properly, the full attention she gave to everything, which was one of the things he genuinely liked about her. She never half looked at things. A map of what? The relationships between magical disciplines. If you understand the axes, you can extrapolate spells that haven't been invented yet, or rediscover ones that have been lost. He pointed to a section of the grid. This cluster here, between charms theory and what the older texts call arithmetic integration, there's a gap in the literature that shouldn't be there. Something connects them and it's been either forgotten or deliberately obscured. Hermione looked at the gap. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking, the particular quality of her concentration when she was genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. How long have you been working on this? Since second week. We've been here 3 weeks. I know. Harry. She said it in the specific way she sometimes said his name when she was trying to decide whether to say the thing she was actually thinking. She'd been doing this more often as October approached, the cautious circumnavigation of something she hadn't found the language for yet. You're not like other first years. No, he agreed. You're not like most people, she tried again. He looked at her. She was watching him with the intensity of someone who has been building a case from evidence and has finally decided to present it. Her brown hair was doing something complicated involving a quill she'd tucked above her ear, and she had ink on her left wrist, and she was, Harry thought, one of the most genuinely alive people he'd met in 10 lifetimes, in the specific way that people who cared completely about ideas were alive. What do you want to ask me? He said. She straightened. In Charms on Monday, Flitwick demonstrated the Wingardium Leviosa and asked us to attempt it. You produced a stable, directed levitation on the first casting. Not a wobble, a stable, directed levitation. The technique you used was, I looked it up afterward, it was a technique that Flitwick himself published in a theoretical paper in 1978. It's not in any of our textbooks. No, Harry said. Where did you learn it? Harry considered her. He trusted her, he'd decided that in the first week, and his decisions of this kind had been reliable across several lifetimes. But trusting someone and giving them information they couldn't contextualize yet were two different things. "Have you ever known something," he said, "without being able to explain how you know it? Not a guess, something solid. Something that you just have." She frowned. "Intuition. Deeper than that. More like, the knowledge is structural. It's load-bearing. You couldn't remove it without the whole building shifting." She was quiet. "That's not a normal thing to experience." "No," he agreed. "Is it connected to how you are? How you think?" She gestured at the grid, at him generally. "Because sometimes it seems like you're not experiencing this place the way the rest of us are. We're all arriving somewhere new. You seem like you already know where you are." Harry looked at his grid for a moment. The fire in the library's reading lamps threw warm light across the parchment, and the books around them breathed their particular old paper breath, and he thought about how to give her something true without giving her something she wasn't ready to hold. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "And I'm asking you not to take it to a professor, not because it's wrong, but because if it reached Dumbledore before I'm ready for that conversation, it would complicate things. Can you agree to that?" Hermione's expression was transparent, the conflict between her instinct for rules and her instinct for honesty about what she actually wanted, which was to know. The wanting one, as it generally did. "Yes," she said. "I remember things," Harry said. "Not things from this life. Things from before. Completely. Clearly. Multiple sets of memories, from different lives, different times. Different people I used to be." He paused. "I woke up on September 1st with all of it. 9 complete previous lives." The silence that followed was Hermione processing at full speed. He watched it, the rapid cycling through skepticism, assessment of evidence, cross-referencing against what she knew about him, reluctant arrival at the conclusion that this was the only explanation that fit. "That's," she said, and stopped. "Yes," he agreed. "That's not documented anywhere in the mainstream literature. There are fringe theories about soul continuity, some cases in the more obscure historical texts, but nothing systematic, nothing." She stopped again. "You've been to Hogwarts before." 9 previous lifetimes," he said. "Though none of them were at Hogwarts specifically. I've been a magical practitioner in a few of them, but none were Wizarding Britain." "You have 9 lifetimes of knowledge in an 11-year-old body," she said. "Yes. That's why you could do the transfiguration and the charms and the, yes." "Harry," she said, and her voice had changed, it had lost the assessing quality and shifted into something rawer, the way her voice went when she talked about things that genuinely moved her. "Does that mean you remember dying? 9 times?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly. She absorbed this. He watched her face move through something private and didn't look away, because looking away would have been a kind of diminishment of whatever she was feeling on his behalf. "Are you all right?" she said finally. He smiled, and it was a real one. "More than I've ever been," he said. "This life is the first one where I woke up with the full picture. Every other life, I was navigating in the dark. This time I can see." She looked at him for a long moment, this extraordinary girl who would have been extraordinary in any century and who was sitting in a library at 11 years old grasping the shape of something that most adults would have flinched from, and she nodded once, with the decisive quality of someone who has made a choice that they intend to keep. "All right," she said. "Then let's figure out what connects those 2 axes on your grid." They worked until Madame Pance's lamps dimmed twice, which was her signal for leaving that she considered significantly more civilized than actually speaking to the students. Harry rolled his grid and Hermione closed her books with the practiced efficiency of someone who bookmarked in her head rather than on the page, and they walked back through the castle together in the quiet of a Wednesday evening. "There's something going on in the 3rd-floor corridor," Hermione said, as they turned up the staircase toward Gryffindor Tower. I heard Percy telling a prefect that 2 first years nearly went through the door last week on a dare. I know, Harry said. You know what's in there? Not precisely. But I know what it's guarding. She stopped on the staircase and looked at him. He kept walking. Are you going to tell me? She called after him. Not yet, he said. But soon. She made a sound that was almost definitely frustration converted into something more dignified, and followed him up the stairs. The week that followed was the week Harry began to advance in earnest. Not visibly, he was already visible enough, the needle from Match and the Wingardium Leviosa having established a reputation that he was now managing carefully. What he began doing privately was a systematic accelerated progression through magical theory that used the castle's library as its primary resource and his 9 lifetimes of accumulated framework as its structure. Edmund Blackwell's magical knowledge was the most directly applicable. The Victorian occultist had worked outside formal wizarding tradition, which meant he developed a theoretical framework that was in some ways more fundamental than the standard curriculum, less assumption-laden, more derived from first principles. Harry was finding places where that framework illuminated things that the standard texts treated as given without explaining why. He also began a clemency. Not because anyone had told him to. Not because he was afraid of Dumbledore or Voldemort accessing his mind. But because he had 9 lifetimes of private experience and thought, and the idea of any of that being accessible to an external reader was somewhere between disrespectful to the people he'd been and strategically inadvisable. Edmund had known a clemency theory. Takeda Hiroshi had known something that was effectively its equivalent in a non-magical context, the practice of maintaining an internal space that external conditions couldn't touch. He practiced in the mornings before the dormitory woke, sitting in the window seat with his feet tucked under him, and built the architecture of it with the patience of someone who had meditated seriously in at least 3 lifetimes. Ron noticed. "What are you doing?" he asked, from his bed, one Tuesday morning with grey Scottish rain on the windows. "Thinking," Harry said. "You do that a lot. Is that a problem?" Ron sat up and looked at him with the unfiltered directness that Harry had come to think of as one of Ron's most valuable qualities. "No," he said. "It's just, most people, when they're thinking, it shows on their face. You just look like you're somewhere else." He paused. "Somewhere that isn't worrying." Harry looked at him. "Does it bother you?" "No," Ron said, again, and meant it. He swung his legs out of bed and reached for his robes. "Fred says it's weird. George says it's brilliant. I think it's just, you." He said this last with the particular casualness of someone who has thought about something, decided on it, and doesn't feel the need to make it into a speech. Harry nodded once. Ron nodded back. This was, he had found, one of the satisfying things about Ron, the conversations that didn't need to become more than they were. Neville's progress was the thing Harry was watching most carefully. Not because he was engineering it, he'd made a specific decision not to be that kind of person in this life, the kind who moved other people toward outcomes he'd decided were good for them. He'd known too many of those people, and he'd occasionally been one of those people, and it always ended poorly for everyone's dignity. What he was doing was simpler than that. He was paying attention. He noticed that Neville knew more about herbology than he thought he knew. His knowledge was instinctive rather than academic, absorbed through years of greenhouse time with his grandmother, and when Harry asked him questions in herbology that made Neville answer before he had time to doubt himself, Neville was consistently right. He noticed that Neville's wand work was tentative not because his magic was weak but because he was convinced it was, and conviction of that kind created the very failure it was predicting. His grip was wrong, too tight, the wrist locked up. Harry mentioned this once, quietly, adjusting Neville's grip during a charms practice session with the minimal words approach of someone who knew that the fewer the words, the less opportunity for self-consciousness to reassert itself. The next casting went cleanly. Neville looked at his own wand with an expression that was entirely new on him. Not pride exactly, something more foundational. The look of someone who has discovered that the thing they thought was missing was there the whole time. He didn't say anything. Neither did Harry. They moved on. Herbology was where it happened properly, 3 weeks into term, when Professor Sprout was introducing them to mandrakes and Neville, unprompted, correctly identified 3 additional properties of the mandrak beyond what Sprout had mentioned: specific interaction with other magical plants, the variation in potency by growth stage, the correct harvesting window. Sprout stopped and looked at him. Neville flushed scarlet. "That is entirely correct," Sprout said, with the warm precision of a teacher who knows praise is a tool and is currently using it very deliberately. 10 points to Gryffindor. The flush on Neville's face went through scarlet and came out on the other side of something else. Harry caught his eye and nodded, once, and went back to his own mandrak, and didn't make anything more of it. The potions dungeon was another matter. Snape's classroom was cold in the way that stone below ground was always cold, a mineral chill that the cauldron fires didn't quite overcome, and it smelled like something that was a combination of strange and ancient and occasionally unpleasant. Harry liked it, because Giacomo the alchemist had worked in a basement laboratory that smelled almost identical, and the smell was associated in his memory with the particular deep satisfaction of transformative work. Snape had not yet made a specific move. He taught with a controlled intensity that was impressive in its technical precision. He was, objectively, an extraordinarily knowledgeable potions master, but underneath the teaching there was a constant lateral awareness of Harry that he was managing carefully. He asked Harry questions in the early lessons with the energy of someone who expected to find a gap, to expose the gap between fame and substance, and Harry answered them accurately, and Snape received these answers with the expression of a man updating a model. In week 3, Snape stopped asking Harry questions. He moved on to other students, and his sessions with Neville became the primary target for his particular brand of pressure, which Harry watched with the specific displeasure of someone who recognized the mechanism, find the most vulnerable person in the room, establish their failure as the example, and filed it under things to address in due course. But in week 4, on a Thursday afternoon, Snape made a technical error. Not a large one. He was explaining the properties of flobberworm mucus in brewing stabilization, and he said something that was technically correct for the standard application but that missed a conditional, a specific temperature interaction condition that Giacomo's practical alchemy had documented and that the mainstream potions literature had apparently not caught up with. Harry said, without planning to, "That's only true below 60 degrees Celsius. Above 60, the mucus destabilizes rather than stabilizes the base." The dungeon went very quiet. Snape turned from the blackboard with the slow, controlled movement of a man who was calibrating his response rather than having it naturally. His black eyes found Harry with an expression that was moving through several stages rapidly and settling somewhere Harry hadn't expected. "Explain," Snape said. Not snapped. Not with contempt. Just, explain. Harry explained. He kept it technical, grounding it in the biochemical logic of the mucus composition and the thermal denaturing of the binding agents, framing it in terms the class could follow. He cited no source, because the source was the private laboratory notebooks of a 16th-century Italian alchemist, and that was not something he was going to introduce into a first-year potions class. Snape listened. He was very still while he listened, which Harry had come to recognize as the specific stillness of a person with an excellent mind encountering something that requires genuine processing. 15 points to Gryffindor, Snape said, and turned back to his board. The class's collective shock was palpable. Harry wrote in his notes. He was aware of Ron's expression beside him, the delighted incredulity of someone watching something they'd been told was impossible, and kept his own face neutral. After class, in the corridor, Dean was saying, "Did Snape actually just," and Seamus was saying, 15 points, and Ron was making a sound that wasn't quite words yet, and Harry walked with them toward the staircase and felt, with some satisfaction, that Snape had been more honest in that moment than he probably intended to be. The man was committed to knowledge. Whatever else he was, whatever complex thing he was working through about Harry's face and James Potter's ghost and Lily Evans's eyes, he was fundamentally committed to getting things right. That was a language Harry spoke fluently. He was thinking about this, about Snape, about the conversation he expected they'd eventually have, about the appropriate timing of it, when he turned the corner of the fourth-floor corridor and walked directly into something that changed his understanding of what Dumbledore had built in this castle. It was a door. Just a door, unremarkable, set into the wall between two portraits. But behind it Harry felt the specific signature of a very old protective charm, not the one on the third-floor corridor, something different, something that had been here longer than the current concealment on the stone. Something that felt like the castle itself, rather than an addition to it. He stopped and put his hand flat on the door. It didn't open. But something on the other side of it noticed him, in the way the wall in the corridor had noticed him on his first week. The same quality of recognition, vast, patient, ancient. He filed it. He did not try the door. He walked on. That evening in the common room, while Hermione was explaining a charms theory problem to a group of second years who had apparently heard she was good at it, and Ron was playing chess against himself again with marginally better results since Harry had adjusted his strategy, Harry wrote a letter. Not to anyone obvious. He wrote it to Gringotts, specifically to the account manager for the Potter Vault, requesting a full accounting of the estate, not just the vault contents, but the property records, the held investments, the secondary accounts that Dumbledore had never mentioned, which Harry was fairly confident existed because wealthy old families always had secondary accounts and the Potters were a very old, moderately wealthy family. He also wrote to the Ministry's Department of Magical Records, requesting a copy of his parents' will. Because he had been a French revolutionary in one life and he knew better than anyone that the first thing powerful people did to maintain control over a situation was manage access to information, and the first thing you did to reclaim that control was find out what you hadn't been told. He sealed both letters, took them to the Ollery, and sent them with 2 of the school owls, and watched them disappear into the cold Scottish night, and stood at the window for a while with his elbows on the stone sill. Voldemort was in the building. The stone was in the building. Dumbledore's design was in motion. And somewhere in the 7th-floor corridor, he had heard, there was a room that appeared and disappeared, a room of requirement, according to a reference in one of the more obscure historical texts he'd found in the library. He had requirements. He went back inside. The response from Gringotts arrived 4 days later, carried by a small, efficient owl that landed on Harry's breakfast plate and waited with professional patience to be relieved of its package. The response was thorough. It was also, as Harry had suspected, significantly more comprehensive than anything Dumbledore had directed him toward. There were 3 secondary vaults. 2 properties, one in Wales, one in the Scottish Highlands, both maintained in trust. There was an executor's account for estate management that had been active since 1981, and the signatory on that account was Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry folded the letter and put it in his inner robe pocket. Ron, who was eating bacon with the dedication it deserved, said, "What's that?" "Financial records," Harry said. "From Gringotts?" "Yes." Ron looked at him. "Is everything, are you all right?" "With the vault and, everything's fine," Harry said. "I just like to know what I have." He picked up his fork. "Your bishop's exposed this morning, by the way." Ron looked down at the miniature chess board he'd set up beside his plate, which he'd been playing while eating for the past week. "I left it there on purpose," he said. "I'm trying to draw Dean's rook into a trap. Dean's 3 seats away. He's going to come over in a minute. He always does." Ron bit his toast with the serene confidence of someone who understood people at their most essential level. He can't resist checking the board. Dean drifted over 40 seconds later, looked at the board, and said, "Your bishop's exposed," in exactly the tone Ron had been expecting. Harry watched Ron's face arrange itself into innocent surprise, and thought that Ron Weasley was considerably cleverer than anyone who knew him casually tended to assume, and that this was both a gift and something that occasionally frustrated the people who loved him, because they tended to see the casual surface and miss the depth underneath. He was still thinking about this when Hermione arrived at the table in a state of controlled urgency that she was not fully controlling. "I found it," she said, sitting down and opening a book she'd apparently carried from the dormitory to breakfast, which was either dedication or she'd been up since before the owls. The gap in your grid, between charms theory and arithmetic integration. It's not forgotten or obscured. It's in the Founders Era texts, but only one copy survived and it's in the restricted section and I think I need a teacher's note to access it. No you don't, Harry said. She looked up. Madam Pants will give you access, he said. Tell her you're researching the theoretical basis of modern charm structure. She'll take you there herself. How do you know that? She's a librarian, he said. She's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions since approximately 1975. Hermione looked at him. You're making a deduction from a general principle about librarians. I'm making a deduction from a general principle about people who love what they know, he said. Which includes you, so you understand exactly what I'm talking about. She considered this. I'll try it this afternoon, she said, and opened her book. What does it connect? Ron asked, looking at her book with the mild interest of someone not particularly invested in arithmetic integration but willing to be adjacent to enthusiasm about it. Something to do with how spells are structured at a fundamental level, Hermione said. The modern understanding treats spells as, sort of, packages. Self-contained. But the Founders Era theory suggests they're more like nodes in a network. Connected to each other and to the ambient magic of a location. Like the castle, Harry said. Yes. She looked at him. Exactly like the castle. I think Hogwarts isn't just a building with magic in it. I think the magic of the building and the spells cast within it are interactive. That the castle actually learns, in a way, from the magic practiced here. Gets stronger. It does, Harry said. The confidence in his voice made both of them look at him. It's been accumulating for 1,000 years, he said. The magic isn't stored. It's awake. He picked up his pumpkin juice. You're on the right track. Find the text. She found the text. She also found, once she had it, that it was written in a mixture of Middle English and early magical notation that she could partially parse and partially couldn't, and she came to Harry that evening in the library with the book in a combination of excitement and frustration that had been pressing at her all afternoon. They worked through it together. It was, Harry let himself feel it, one of the best evenings he'd spent in this life or most others. The two of them across a library table with 1,000-year-old text and the particular electric feeling of ideas that fit. The founders had understood something that the modern curriculum had smoothed over for reasons of practicality, that magic was not a tool. It was a relationship. Between the caster and the magic, between the magic and the location, between the location and the people in it. This changes the way I understand the Wingardium Leviosa, Hermione said at one point, staring at a passage. It changes the way you should understand every spell, Harry said. It means the theory we've been taught is, not wrong, but, incomplete, Harry said. Right. She was quiet for a moment. Harry. If this is right, if spells are nodes in a network, then the reason your castings are so clean isn't just knowledge. It's that you're not treating the magic like a tool. You're treating it like a conversation, he said. She looked at him across the book. Yes, she said softly. They sat with that for a moment, the fire burning low in the reading lamps and the library quiet around them. Then Hermione said, in a completely different tone, I've been reading about the Philosopher's Stone. Harry set down his quill. Not the one that might be here, she clarified quickly, which told him she'd been thinking about it for longer than she was admitting. Just the general theory. Flamel's work. The alchemical principles. She looked at him. You said you knew what was in the third-floor corridor. Yes. Is it the stone? He met her eyes. Yes. And someone wants it, she said. Someone's already in the building who wants it, he said. She absorbed this with the controlled steadiness of someone running through implications at speed and keeping the fear below the analytical layer. "Quirrell," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I've noticed," she said, with a slight defensive edge. "I'm not an idiot. He's wrong in a way that's specific and consistent, and I looked up possession of human subjects by fragmented dark entities in the library last week." Harry looked at her with what he recognized, from the inside, as deep affection. "You didn't say anything," he said. "You already knew," she said. "I was waiting to see when you'd decide it was time to talk about it." "And now?" "Now I'm tired of waiting." She folded her hands on the table with the composure of someone who had made a decision. "What's the plan?" "I don't have a plan yet," he said. "I have an understanding of the situation and a set of principles I'm going to operate from." "Which are?" "That Voldemort doesn't get the stone," he said. "That when I deal with it on my terms, not because Dumbledore's 7-obstacle course has ushered me there. And that nobody important gets hurt." "Nobody important meaning you and Ron and Neville stay out of the direct path of this," he said. "When the time comes." Hermione opened her mouth. "I know," he said, before she could. "I know you'll argue with me about that, and I know you think you should be involved, and we'll have that conversation. But not yet. Let me understand what we're actually dealing with first." She closed her mouth. Then opened it again. "Fine," she said. "But I want full information as it develops." "You'll have it," he said. She gathered her books. They walked back through the castle in the late library quiet, and at the foot of the staircase to Gryffindor Tower, she stopped. "Harry," she said. "Thank you. For telling me. About the other lives." She said it with a slight careful quality, like something she was handling thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about it every day since." "Has it changed anything?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered it seriously, which he'd expected. "It's made me think about how much of what I assume about knowledge is about accumulation," she said slowly. "Like, I've always thought knowing more was straightforwardly better. But you know more than almost anyone, and the thing that's different about you isn't the quantity of what you know. It's how you hold it." He looked at her. "You don't seem like the knowledge is for anything," she said. "Like it's not a means to an end. It's just what you are." He was quiet for a moment. "That took me approximately 7 lifetimes to figure out," he said. She laughed, a real one, the surprised kind. "I'd like to get there faster, if possible." "You're 11, he said. "You're already more than halfway there." She smiled, and it was unguarded in a way her smiles weren't always. "Good night, Harry." "Good night, Hermione." He went up to the dormitory. Neville was awake, sitting on his bed with Trevor in his lap and a herbology textbook open, not reading it but holding it the way people held something familiar. "Good evening in the library?" Neville asked. "Very good," Harry said. "How was Trevor?" "He escaped again," Neville said, with the resigned affection of a man fully committed to his mistakes. "Seamus found him in a shoe." "Whose shoe?" "His own, thank God." Neville watched Harry kick off his shoes and sit on his own bed. "Harry," he said. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Harry said. "Why do you—" he stopped, reformulated. "You could ignore me. A lot of people sort of do. I'm not very impressive." "Stop," Harry said, not unkindly. Neville stopped. "You know more about herbology than Sprout expected any first year to know," Harry said. "Your magical instincts are correct more often than not when you stop interfering with them. You're one of the most genuinely honest people in this castle, which is rarer than you think. And you're kind without it being a performance, which is rarer still." He met Neville's eyes. "Those aren't small things, Neville." Neville was quiet for a moment. Trevor croaked. "Okay," Neville said finally. Small word, but the way he said it, like something had settled. Also, Harry said, Trevor is very determined. That's admirable in a toad. Neville laughed, a short, startled sound, and it bounced off the stone walls of the dormitory and came back warm. Harry lay down and looked at the canopy and listened to the sound of the castle at night, the deep, slow breathing of a building that was old and alive and paying attention, and thought about what Hermione had said. How you hold it. He turned it over in the dark. He had held knowledge in other lives like a weapon, and like a shield, and like a burden, and like a gift. He had been a man who used what he knew to accumulate power and a man who used it to serve and a man who let it separate him from everyone around him. This life he wanted something different. He wanted to hold it lightly. Not carelessly, lightly in the way that meant it had room to be useful, room to be shared, room to grow. The castle breathed around him in the dark, and somewhere in the third-floor corridor, a stone sat behind 7 obstacles, and somewhere at the back of a man's head, a cold and hungry remnant of a dark lord waited, and in the morning there would be transfiguration and charms and Ron at breakfast with his chessboard and Neville with his toad and Hermione with whatever book she'd started at 6 a.m., and the library was full of questions that hadn't been asked yet. Harry Potter, 10th life, 11 years old, closed his eyes and was profoundly, specifically glad to be here. Chapter 4. The shape of a war. Halloween arrived the way it always did at Hogwarts, with excessive decoration and the specific smell of 500 pumpkins being magically carved simultaneously, which was a smell that had no real equivalent outside of Scotland in late October with magic in the air. The Great Hall had been transformed overnight into something that was half harvest festival and half theatrical production, with floating candles and live bats and jack-o'-lanterns that were doing things with their carved expressions that their muggle counterparts couldn't manage. Harry walked in for breakfast and took it all in and felt, briefly, purely 11. Then he sat down and poured himself tea and the 11-year-old sensation settled back into the larger context of everything else he was, which was fine. That was how it worked. The two things weren't in conflict, the genuine newness of this life and the accumulated weight of 9 others. They coexisted. He'd stopped trying to keep them separate. Ron arrived 30 seconds later, dropped into his seat with the boneless ease of someone who had not yet fully woken up, and stared at the jack-o'-lantern opposite him for a long moment. "It winked at me," he said. "They do that," Harry said. "How do you know?" "I don't. I inferred it from the general principle that everything at Hogwarts is more animated than it has any right to be." Ron looked at the pumpkin again. "It winked." "Right," he said, and reached for the toast with the resigned acceptance of a person who had been raised in a magical household and still somehow found new things to be mildly unsettled by. Hermione arrived with a book. She always arrived with a book, this one about advanced charms theory that she'd been working through since the previous Thursday, and Neville arrived with Trevor secured in a pocket specifically reinforced for toad containment, a solution Harry had quietly suggested after the third escape. They ate breakfast while the hall filled with Halloween energy, which was a specific variety of collective anticipation that Harry had experienced in many forms across many lives and which always had the same quality, the feeling of something being on the edge of happening. He was watching Quirrell. Not directly. From the peripheral awareness he'd been cultivating since the first week, which let him track people across a room without looking at them. Quirrell was eating almost nothing, his hands around a cup of something steaming, his attention scattered in the way of someone whose internal landscape was contested. The cold presence at the back of his head was stronger this morning. Harry could feel it from the Gryffindor table, the particular chill of it, like a window left open in winter. It was reaching. Not for the stone, not yet, it hadn't moved in that direction, but stretching its awareness outward in the way a restricted consciousness did when it was testing its boundaries. It was looking for something, or feeling for something, and Harry suspected it had found something it was thinking about. He ate his eggs and kept his face on his breakfast and thought methodically. The stone was behind 7 obstacles in the third-floor corridor. He knew the obstacles existed, knew their general nature from what the castle's ambient magic told him and from what the historical precedent of this kind of layered magical protection suggested. He had not yet gone to look, because going to look was a deliberate choice and he hadn't yet decided what he would do when he made it. What he was most certain of was this: Dumbledore had built those obstacles as a gauntlet. Not for Voldemort. No reasonable person designed a magical defense and thought it would stop Voldemort, but for Harry. The specific nature of the obstacles was almost certainly calibrated to require a first-year student with specific skills and specific friends. It was elegant, in its way. A designed experience, meant to shape a boy into a hero. Harry had been a general. He did not walk into designed experiences without choosing to. He also had a practical concern that Dumbledore's design appeared to have overlooked, which was that Quirrell was a teacher with staff access to the third-floor corridor and had presumably already scoped the obstacles thoroughly, and the question of what was stopping him from simply going through them tonight was one that had been occupying Harry's thinking for the past 2 weeks. The answer, he suspected, was the mirror. He'd found a reference in one of the Founders-era texts, oblique, in that layered Middle English they'd been translating, to a magical artifact that showed desire rather than reality. The specific kind of desire that was self-defeating. Show a man dying of thirst a vision of water and he would drink and die of thirst. Show Voldemort the stone and he would see himself holding it but never think to look at his own hands. It was, he thought, genuinely brilliant. It was also not going to work forever. After breakfast, walking to Charms, Ron fell into step beside him and said in a low voice, "Did you see Quirrell this morning?" Harry glanced at him. "He looked wrong," Ron said. "More wrong than usual. Like, more pale." "I noticed," Harry said. "Something's happening," Ron said, with the directness of someone whose instincts were operating correctly and who wasn't going to dress them up in qualifications. "Isn't it?" Harry looked at him. Ron looked back, and his expression was the one it got when he decided to be fully present in a conversation, the blue eyes clear and the usual deflective humor entirely absent. "Yes," Harry said. "Are you going to tell me what?" "Not everything," Harry said. "But enough. Tonight, after dinner. Common room." Ron nodded once. "All right." They went to Charms. Flitwick was in his element on Halloween. He'd decorated his classroom with a collection of charm-animated leaves that drifted in patterns that were technically demonstrating the principles of the locomotion charm and were also simply beautiful, which Harry thought was an excellent approach to pedagogy. They were practicing the color change charm, a piece of transfiguration-adjacent spellwork that required a specific blend of intent and focus. Harry cast it cleanly. He then spent the remainder of the practical session working on a more advanced application that wasn't in the lesson plan, using the same wand movement with a modified intent to achieve a gradient rather than a flat color change. The magic pushed back slightly on the modification, which was interesting. It had a preferred shape and was willing to be directed but not arbitrarily overridden. He noted this. Filed it under Magic as Conversation, Magic with Preferences, which was consistent with the Founders-era framework he and Hermione had been building. Flitwick appeared at his shoulder, looked at the gradient effect Harry had produced on a piece of parchment, and said nothing for a long moment. "That's not in the curriculum," he said. "No," Harry agreed. "It's using the same foundational motion as the standard charm." "The intent modification is in the hold," Harry said. "The wand motion establishes the channel. The intent directs the output. They're separable." Flitwick sat down on the edge of the nearest desk, which brought him to approximately eye level, and looked at the parchment with an expression that moved through several stages and settled somewhere between delighted and deeply thoughtful. "Who taught you that principle?" "I worked it out from the structure of the standard charm," Harry said. "And some Founders-era theoretical texts I've been reading in the library." "Which texts?" Harry told him. Flitwick's expression went through another cycle. "Those texts they're very old, Mr. Potter. The theoretical framework they use was largely abandoned in the 17th century in favor of the standardized curriculum." "Abandoned or set aside?" Harry said. Flitwick looked at him. "That," he said, "is an excellent distinction." He stood up, recollected himself as a teacher delivering a class, and moved away, but he looked back once from the front of the room with the expression of a man who had filed something important. After class, in the corridor, Hermione said, "He's going to want to talk to you properly." "I know," Harry said. "Is that a problem?" "No." Flitwick's genuinely interested in the magic. "He doesn't have an agenda." She started. "Unlike some people," Harry said. "Yes." She was quiet a moment. "I spoke to Madame Pants about the secondary founder's texts yesterday. She found 3 more volumes. 2 of them had never been checked out. She said it with the specific reverence of someone for whom an unchecked-out book was a kind of tragedy. One of them has a section on what it calls ambient magical integration. I think it's describing how the magic of a place and the magic of the people in it affect each other over time." "Hogwarts," Harry said. "More than Hogwarts. Any magically inhabited space. But Hogwarts is the most extreme example because it's been continuously inhabited for so long." She paused. "Harry, if this is right, if we've been absorbing the castle's magic and the castle's been absorbing ours, then we're fundamentally different as magical practitioners from people who trained outside Hogwarts. Different at a core level." Harry thought about the way the castle had responded to his hand on the wall. The warmth. The recognition. "Yes," he said. "I think that's right. That means the magic we can do here, in this building, is potentially, don't get too far ahead," he said, not unkindly. "Understand it first. Then work out what it means." She gave him a look that communicated, efficiently, that she was going to think about it anyway. He accepted this as the fundamental nature of Hermione Granger and moved on. The afternoon was defense against the dark arts, and it was where the day changed. Quirrell taught the lesson with the superficial function of a man running a performance that was taking increasing effort to maintain. The stutter was worse. The hands on his wand, he barely demonstrated spells himself, preferring to walk students through theory, were not quite steady. Harry sat in the front row and watched from behind attentive first-year eyes and felt the cold presence at the back of Quirrell's head like weather. It was more active than it had been this morning. It was aware, specifically aware of Harry, in the way it had been since the term began, but differently today. Less like a general ambient awareness and more like something that had made a decision. Harry kept his face on his notes. Quirrell was explaining the theory of the impediment jinx, which was solid enough, when he stopped mid-sentence. The pause was fractional, a half-second gap where the man's rhythm broke, and then he continued, but something had shifted. The cold presence was right at the surface, briefly, pressing against the back of Quirrell's skull from inside with the quality of something trying to come forward. Then it retreated. And Quirrell continued the lesson. Harry wrote down the impediment jinx theory and underneath it, in the same even handwriting, wrote, "Tonight. It's decided something about tonight." After class he waited until everyone else had filed out and then said, without inflection, "Professor Quirrell. The theory you gave for the impediment jinx, can you clarify the mechanism by which the jinx interacts with a target that has active magical protection? The textbook's explanation seems to assume no pre-existing shielding." Quirrell turned. His face was doing several things at once, the front-of-face anxiety, the deeper cold beneath it, and underneath both of those something that might have been the real queerness Quirrell trying to maintain purchase on his own expression. Harry met his eyes directly. Not challenging. Not provoking. Just, clear. The way he'd learned to look at things in Takeda's life, where the practice of direct looking without reaction had been literally decades of work. The cold presence looked back at him from behind Quirrell's eyes. Felt him. Felt what he was. The fractional widening of Quirrell's pupils. The slight drop in temperature around them that wasn't environmental. And then the cold presence retreated again, sharply, like touching something it hadn't expected. Quirrell answered the question about the impediment jinx. His voice was technically steady. He explained the interaction with pre-existing shielding with the accuracy of a man with genuine knowledge and a very complicated life. "Thank you," Harry said, and left. In the corridor, he stood for a moment and breathed, and reassessed. Voldemort had looked at him. Had touched the edge of Harry's mind with that cold awareness and had encountered, what? Not a blank. Not a shield exactly. Something like what happened when you pushed against a wall and found the wall was paying attention to you in return. It would not ignore him after that. He walked to the Great Hall for the Halloween feast, sat with Ron and Hermione and Neville in the orange candlelit warmth of the decorated hall, and ate roast chicken and talked about nothing consequential, and waited. The feast was magnificent. He let himself enjoy it fully, the food, the candles, the bats swooping overhead in patterns that were either accidental or choreographed and were impressive either way, the general atmosphere of 500 people all being temporarily unburdened by the ordinary. He had the trifle, which was extraordinary. He had seconds of the trifle. He noted that Ron ate with a focused joy that was entirely present tense, and that Hermione was making herself not read at dinner by the visible effort of keeping her book in her bag, and that Neville had, for the first time since Harry had known him, laughed unself-consciously twice in 20 minutes. He was still in this, still present in the warmth of it, when the doors of the Great Hall burst open and Professor Quirrell came running in. Not walking quickly. Running. His turban was askew and his face was white, and he crashed into a table and caught himself on it and looked up at the entire hall staring at him and said, in a voice that Harry noted was entirely free of the usual stutter, "Troll. In the dungeon. Thought you ought to know." He then fainted. Or performed a very convincing approximation of fainting. The hall erupted. The noise of 500 people all reacting to "Troll" simultaneously was extraordinary. Benches scraping, voices overlapping, someone screaming on what seemed like principle. Dumbledore fired into the air with a sound like a cannon and the hall went quiet. Harry sat very still. Interesting, he thought. The cold presence had made its move. Not toward the stone, not yet, probably, but something was being cleared. Quirrell creating the diversion of the troll while the real business happened somewhere else. It was not a sophisticated plan. It was the plan of something desperate and stripped down, operating on instinct rather than strategy, which actually made it harder to predict than a sophisticated plan would have been. Dumbledore's voice rang through the hall, directing prefects to lead students to their dormitories, heads of house to stay. Harry watched Dumbledore's face. There was something there, a precise, controlled quality, a man managing several calculations at once. Not surprised, Harry thought. Or not surprised in the way someone who hadn't prepared for this would be. The headmaster's eyes moved across the room and found Harry's for 1 second, and what passed in that second was too quick and too complex to fully read but contained, Harry thought, a question. "Stay safe," it said. Or, "Don't be a hero." Or possibly, "Not yet." Harry held the gaze for a beat and then looked away. Percy Weasley was herding Gryffindors toward the door with the magnificent urgency of a head boy who had trained for exactly this moment. Harry stood, and Ron and Hermione and Neville stood with him, and they joined the flow of students moving out of the hall. In the crowded corridor, Harry said, under the noise of 300 students, "Hermione. The girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor." She looked at him. "What?" "The trolls in the dungeons," he said. "But there's a troll in the 2nd floor girls' bathroom." "How do you?" "Because Quirrell let it in somewhere it would cause maximum disruption with minimum access to the stone, and the 2nd floor bathroom has a window that opens from outside and is consistently unmonitored because nobody uses it in the evenings." He said it in the flat, certain tone of someone not speculating. Hermione stared at him. "There are 2 trolls?" "No. 1. It went through the dungeons and up." He paused. "Did you come down from the dormitory before dinner or did you come from the library?" Her face changed. "Library," she said. "2nd floor. I might not have heard the general message about the feast being moved," You heard it, Harry said. You were in your section. My section is, she stopped. Past the second-floor bathroom. He met her eyes. Yes. The three of them, because Ron was already there and Neville had not moved away, looked at each other in the moving current of evacuating students, and Harry watched them make their decision. He didn't make it for them. He waited. Ron said, "We should check." "We should," Neville said, quietly, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before the month that had just passed, a smallness that had become something else. "I'm coming," Hermione said, in her decisive voice, and Harry noted that she'd already stepped out of the student flow and back against the wall. "Right," Harry said. "Second floor. Move quickly. Don't touch anything, don't separate, and if you see it before I do, tell me and then get behind me." "Why behind you?" Ron said, as they moved. "Because I know how to handle it," Harry said. Ron's expression moved through several options and settled on accepting this at face value. They went up the stairs against the flow of students going down, which drew some looks but not intervention. The general chaos was providing cover, and along the second-floor corridor in the direction of the bathroom. Harry felt it before he heard it. The specific magical displacement of something large in an enclosed space, a vibration in the floor and walls that his body identified before his conscious mind registered it. He put his hand out, stopping them. They listened. Something crashed on the other side of the wall ahead of them. Something large that walked heavily and was doing structural damage to bathroom fixtures. Harry said, quietly, "Stay here." "Harry," Hermione started. "1 minute," he said. "If I'm not out in 1 minute, follow me in." He opened the bathroom door. The troll was enormous. The reasonable intellectual understanding of 12 feet tall, and the physical reality of standing in a tiled bathroom opposite 12 feet of gray, thick-skinned, club-wielding mountain troll were two different experiences, and Harry took 1 second to reconcile them, to let his body catch up with what his eyes were showing, and then he was fully present in the room and assessing. The troll hadn't seen him yet. It was engaged in destroying the bathroom, which it appeared to find interesting in the way very simple creatures found destruction interesting. The noise and the breaking were the point, not any specific target. Club through a cubicle partition. Step on the pieces. Look at the result. Repeat. Harry took in the room. Stone floor, slippery from what had been in the sinks before the troll knocked them off the wall. Low ceiling by troll standards, maybe 18 inches of clearance above its head. The door behind Harry. The window high on the far wall. The troll's club, which was approximately the length of a small tree, swinging loosely from its right hand. He'd fought larger things than this. Edmund Blackwell had stood in a ritual circle and held a containment for 7 hours against something that made this troll look like a garden ornament. Kofi Asante had walked onto battlefields that looked considerably more threatening. He was also 11 years old, and the thing about being 11 years old was that the body's threat response didn't care about past life confidence. His hands were steady but his heart was moving faster than he'd have liked, and he acknowledged this as accurate information rather than weakness and worked with it. He drew his wand. "Hey," he said. The troll turned. Its small, deep-set eyes found him, and its expression, if expression was the right word for the arrangement of a troll's face, did the thing it did when it found something worth hitting. The club came up. Harry moved. Not away from it, that was the instinctive response that the troll expected, the one it was positioned for. He moved toward it and left, inside the swing of the club, and the club hit the floor behind him with a crash that shook the tiles, and Harry was already moving again, up onto the lip of the destroyed sink basin, which brought him level with the troll's shoulder, and he pressed his wand against the back of the troll's neck where the skin was thin, and said, with the focused precision of someone casting from complete understanding of what the spell did, "Stupefy." The stunning spell at that range, pressed directly against skin, had a different quality than at a distance. It didn't shoot, it poured. He could feel the magic channeling out of his wand and into the troll's nervous system, and it hit the troll's enormous body like a stone hitting a pond, one central impact and then radiating outward through everything connected to it. The troll swayed. It was a big body. The stunner had hit cleanly, but it took 3 seconds to reach all the way to the extremities, and in those 3 seconds the club came down on pure reflex, glancing off the sink base and catching Harry's left shoulder. It didn't break anything, it hit at a deflected angle, kinetic energy already dissipating, but it moved him off the sink basin and he landed on the wet floor in a controlled roll and came up on one knee. The troll sat down. Heavily. Then fell sideways. The floor shook when it hit. Harry stood up, assessed his shoulder, bruised, not broken, mobility intact, and let himself breathe for 5 actual seconds. Then he put his wand away. The door opened. Ron and Neville and Hermione came in, which had been approximately 90 seconds rather than the 60 he'd said, and he decided not to mention it. They all looked at the troll. "Right," Ron said, in the specific voice of someone who has decided that awe is the correct response and is going with it fully. "Right, okay. Are you all right?" Neville said, looking at Harry with the focused concern of someone who had noticed the way Harry had come off the sink basin. "Fine," Harry said. "Shoulder. It'll bruise." Hermione was looking at Harry with an expression he couldn't fully read, something that was moving between relief and something else, something that was still processing. Her hair was wild and her eyes were bright and she was, he noticed, gripping her wand in a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "You pressed the spell against its skin," she said. "Less range loss," he said. "More efficient." "That's not in any first-year text." "No." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then did something Harry hadn't fully anticipated. She crossed the bathroom in 3 steps and hugged him, briefly, with the decisive quality of someone who had decided that the situation warranted it and was going to act on that decision rather than second-guess it. He was so surprised that it took him a full second to react, and then he returned it, and over her shoulder he saw Ron and Neville both looking away in the specific way of boys who were choosing not to see something that would require them to have feelings about it. She stepped back. Her chin was up and her face was entirely composed. "Don't tell anyone I did that," she said. "Did what?" Harry said. She almost smiled. The teachers arrived 3 minutes later, McGonagall and Snape and Quirrell, which was its own kind of information. McGonagall surveyed the scene, the destroyed bathroom, the unconscious troll, for first years all present and intact, with an expression that went through approximately 8 stages and came out somewhere between furious and something she was actively suppressing. "Explain," she said. Hermione explained. She did it with brisk accuracy, covering the sequence of events and presenting it as a collective response to a threat. She did not mention Harry's specific actions in terms that would invite close questioning. Harry watched her construct the explanation and noted that Hermione Granger, who had committed herself thoroughly to honesty as a principle, was choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that accuracy and complete disclosure were not the same thing. Snape was looking at Harry. His expression was the assessing one, the model updating one, and his eyes moved to Harry's left shoulder with the brief professional precision of someone who had noticed the way Harry was holding it and had correctly identified the cause. He said nothing about this. McGonagall gave them 5 points each for sheer luck. She delivered the speech about the rules and the danger and the extraordinary irresponsibility of coming toward a troll rather than away from one, and she delivered it well, and Harry listened to it respectfully because she wasn't wrong and she meant it. He also noted that she had given them points, which told him what the speech was trying to conceal, that she was, underneath the fury, something else about these 4 first years standing in a destroyed bathroom with an unconscious troll. As they filed out, Quirrell preceding them into the corridor with the exaggerated shakiness of his performance, Harry let himself drift momentarily closer than the others to the man. The cold presence was there. Still. Subdued from whatever it had been doing, and Harry's best assessment now was that it hadn't gone for the stone tonight. Tonight had been reconnaissance. A test of the castle's response, of Dumbledore's response, of Harry's response. It had learned things. So had Harry. He let the distance open again between himself and Quirrell and rejoined his friends, and they walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the late-night castle quiet. In the common room, which was full of students who had been sent back early and were now processing the evening with the buzzing energy of people who had experienced something, Harry sat in the corner chair by the fire and thought. Ron sat beside him and said nothing for a good 3 minutes, which was its own kind of communication. Neville was across the room being asked about what happened by a group of second years, and Harry watched him answer, watched the quality of his posture, the way he stood. Slightly different from how he'd stood that morning. You knew, Ron said, finally. Not accusing. Observing. About the troll? Not specifically. About something happening tonight, yes. Because of Quirrell. Yes. And you couldn't have just told a teacher earlier? Harry looked at him. I could have. I could have gone to Dumbledore this morning and told him I had a concern about Quirrell specifically tonight, and Dumbledore would have listened with great interest and thanked me and told me to let the adults handle it and then used whatever I told him to reinforce a situation he's managing rather than resolve it. Ron processed this. So you let it happen. I mitigated it, Harry said. The troll was going to be there whether I told anyone or not. What I changed was whether Hermione was in that bathroom alone when it arrived. Ron was quiet. The fire popped. Across the room, Neville's posture had changed again. He was standing slightly taller, in the way of someone who had discovered tonight that they were the kind of person who goes toward things. Is this going to keep happening? Ron said. Dangerous things. Yes, Harry said. Right. Ron looked at the fire. Right. Okay. He leaned back in his chair. I'm rubbish at defense theory but my chess strategy is excellent and I have very good instincts in the moment, just so you know. Harry looked at him. In case it's relevant, Ron said. To future dangerous things. It's relevant, Harry said. They sat by the fire while the common room noise settled into the lower frequency of a late night, and Harry thought about Quirrell and about Dumbledore and about the cold presence that had looked at him through the defense professor's eyes and found something unexpected in the returned gaze. He thought about Dumbledore's study on Sunday mornings and the cups of tea and the careful architecture of a plan built around a boy it still believed it was shaping. He thought about the executor's account at Gringotts, and the will he hadn't yet received a response about, and the 3 secondary vaults, and the properties in Wales and the Highlands. He thought about the Room of Requirement, which he still hadn't found, and the Founders-era texts, and the section on ambient magical integration. He thought about 9 lives ending and this one beginning on September 1st with the full picture for the first time, and the decision he'd made in a cupboard before breakfast with the ceiling the wrong color above him. He was not going to play the assigned role. He was going to play his own. The distinction was becoming clearer every week, which meant it was time to be more deliberate about what that actually looked like. Time to stop observing and start moving. He pulled out a piece of parchment. What are you doing? Ron said. Making a list, Harry said. Of what? Harry thought about how to answer that. About the stone, and the mirror, and Voldemort reduced to a cold passenger in a nervous man's skull. About Dumbledore's designed gauntlet. About the thing Voldemort had felt tonight when it looked at him. Everything I know, he said. And everything I need to do. He wrote for an hour, in the handwriting that was 11-year-old Harry's with the intent behind it of 9 previous lives, and when he was done he read it back and then held it to the fire, and watched it burn. He didn't need the list anymore. It was in him. It had always been in him. Hermione appeared at his shoulder as he was watching the last of the parchment curl and go to ash. What was that? She said. Notes, he said. She looked at the fire for a moment. Harry. The troll was a distraction. Yes. What was it distracting from? He met her eyes. The common room was quieter now, students drifting to bed. The fire was lower and her face in its light was serious and present and entirely committed. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "Tomorrow. All three of you. And then we decide together what we know and what we do." She held his gaze for a moment. "All three of us," she said. "Not just me." "All three," he said. "Ron's instincts and Neville's groundedness and your theory and my, whatever I am." He said the last bit with genuine lightness. She considered him. "What are you, exactly?" He looked at the dying fire. The question that Neville had asked on the train, in a different form, and that he'd given a different answer to because it was a different kind of night. "Someone who's done this before," he said. "In enough different ways to know that doing it alone is the worst version." She nodded once. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." She went to bed. He stayed by the fire a few minutes longer, and the last ember of the parchment went dark, and the room was quiet, and somewhere in the castle the unconscious troll was presumably being dealt with and the stone was behind its 7 obstacles and Voldemort was sitting in the back of a man's skull having learned something tonight that would change his calculations. Harry looked at the dark grate and felt, with complete clarity, the shape of what was coming. Not the details, he wasn't precognitive, 9 lifetimes or not, but the shape. The gathering momentum of it. The way the year was moving toward a point, the way water moved toward a drain. He wasn't afraid of it. He was, if anything, ready. He banked the fire, the way he'd learned to in Kofi's life when sleeping in a war camp and you kept the coals for morning, and went up to bed. Chapter 5, Older than the stone. November came in hard off the Scottish mountains and didn't apologize for it. The castle responded the way it always had, drawing in, deepening, the fires in the common rooms burning higher without anyone asking them to, the portraits pulling their painted cloaks tighter and moving between frames more often, as if the cold encouraged visiting. Harry liked November at Hogwarts. It had a specific quality of interior warmth that only existed because the exterior was so definitively not warm, and he'd always found that contrast clarifying. In Takeda's life he'd done his clearest thinking in late autumn, sitting with the dojo doors open to cold air and a cup of hot tea going cold in his hands. He did something similar now, most mornings, in the window seat of the dormitory before the others woke. Feet tucked under him, the Highland Mountains dim and vast through old glass, thinking through what he knew and what he intended. He knew considerably more than he had in October. The response from the ministry had arrived 3 weeks after he'd sent the letter, delayed by what he suspected was deliberate bureaucratic friction, the kind that happened when someone with oversight of a file noticed an inquiry and wanted time to consider their response. When it came, it was a single page. Formal. Terse. Regretted to inform that the will of James and Lily Potter had been sealed under ministerial authority following the events of October 31, 1981, and remained sealed pending the resolution of ongoing matters of national magical security. Sealed. He'd sat with this for 2 days before deciding what it meant. Not what it said, what it meant. A sealed will meant decisions made in that will couldn't be contested. Guardianship arrangements, financial management, property oversight. Everything that had been decided in the hours after his parents' deaths was locked where he couldn't see it. He'd written back. A second letter, more specific, requesting the statutory basis for the sealing order and the name of the ministry official who had authorized it. He'd received a response in 3 days this time, faster, which told him someone was watching the correspondence more carefully now. The authorizing official was listed as Bartemius Crouch Sr., Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The statutory basis cited was a wartime emergency provision from 1979. The war had been over for 10 years. The provision had not been lifted. He'd filed all of this, and he'd told Hermione, and she'd made a sound that was somewhere between outrage and academic fascination and had immediately pulled 4 books about magical law. He'd also started, quietly, drafting a letter to a solicitor, a magical one, found in the back pages of one of the historical texts in the library, a firm that had apparently been dealing with magical estate law since the 16th century. He was 11. He was also, technically, one of the primary stakeholders in a sealed estate, and there was no age minimum on having legal representation. Giacomo the alchemist had been embroiled in 3 separate legal disputes with Italian noble families before he was 20, and had learned the hard way that you didn't wait for other people to stop doing things to you before you started doing things yourself. All of this was in motion. None of it was urgent in the way that the stone was urgent. He'd had the conversation with all 3 of them the morning after Halloween, Sunday, the common room quiet and the fire rebuilt, Neville with tea and Ron with toast and Hermione with a notebook, and he'd laid it out with the flat, specific clarity of a general briefing a command staff. What was in the 3rd-floor corridor? What Quirrell was? What Voldemort wanted and why, and what would happen if he got it? Neville had said, "So Voldemort is actually in the building." "Yes," Harry said. "And he's been in the building since September." "Yes." Neville absorbed this with the stillness of someone who had been afraid of their own shadow for 10 years and was now, in the specific light of something genuinely frightening, discovering that they were less fragile than they'd been told. "All right," he said. "What do we do?" This was why Harry had told them. Not because he needed their help tactically, he didn't, and he wasn't going to pretend he did for the sake of their feelings. He'd told them because they were his people and they deserved the truth, and because the kind of person he wanted to be in this life was not the kind who protected people by keeping them ignorant. He'd been that person before, in the life of the Roman general, and the people he'd tried to protect by managing their information had ended up less equipped to survive what came, not more. Hermione had already been thinking about the obstacles in the corridor, and over the following weeks she'd assembled a working theory of what they were based on the known expertise of the professors involved and the defensive magical traditions each of them practiced. It was impressive analysis, and largely accurate as far as Harry could tell, and he told her so without qualification. Ron had said, "So if it came to it, if we had to get to the stone, we could get through them." "I could get through them," Harry said. "That's not a boast. The obstacles are calibrated for a first-year student, which means they're not calibrated for someone with my background." "Right," Ron said. "But we'd be there." Harry met his eyes. "Yes," he said. "You'd be there." This had satisfied Ron in a way that a longer explanation wouldn't have. He wanted the truth about his role, not flattery about it, and the truth was that his presence and his instincts and his absolute, structural reliability as a person who would be exactly where he said he'd be were worth more than any tactical ability. November deepened and the conversations about the stone continued, woven into the larger fabric of the term. Quidditch trials came and went. Harry had gone, because Kofi Asante had believed deeply that you played the game you were good at and didn't pretend otherwise, and because he genuinely wanted to fly. He'd made the Gryffindor team a seeker, which had caused a reaction among students and staff ranging from impressed to suspicious. He'd taken the reaction with equanimity and gone to his first practice with Wood, who was so committed to Quidditch strategy that Harry had immediately and sincerely liked him. Wood's strategy sessions had a quality Harry recognized, the combination of passion and rigor that produced actual excellence rather than just confident performance. Harry had sat through 3 of them and contributed twice, and on the second contribution, a tactical adjustment to the Seeker's positioning during the opponent's offensive phase that Wood had stopped dead in the middle of his diagram to think about, Wood had looked at him with the expression of someone reassessing what they were dealing with. "How old are you?" Wood had said. 11, Harry said. "Right," Wood said, in the tone of someone choosing to set aside the complicating implications and focus on the practical benefit. The Gryffindor common room had a new quality to it as November went on. Harry's social geography within it had shifted from the first weeks. He was still not at the center of it, still not the kind of person who needed a room's attention, but there was a gravity that had formed around him and his 3, which other students orbited at varying distances. The twins, who had decided early that Harry was interesting and had been conducting a long investigation into exactly what made him interesting, were regular visitors to their corner. Fred said, one evening in mid-November, dropping into the chair beside Harry with the relaxed ownership of someone who considered all common room furniture jointly held, "Can we ask you something?" "You're going to either way," Harry said. Fred smiled. It was the specific Fred smile, the one that was always thinking two things at once and didn't mind you knowing it. You've been here 3 months. You've never once seemed like you were surprised by anything. Not the castle, not the classes, not the owls. First years are usually, he gestured at the air. Overwhelmed? Harry said. We prefer, entertainingly disoriented, George said, from the other chair, materializing in the way the twins did when the conversation warranted both of them. I read a great deal before I came, Harry said, which was technically true. You read that nothing would surprise you? Fred said. I read about the castle, about the magic, about the history. Surprise is mostly just the gap between expectation and reality. If the expectation is accurate enough, there's no gap, George said, looking at him with the acute attention that lived underneath his performance of casualness. Roughly, Harry said. The twins exchanged a look. It was the look they exchanged when they'd confirmed something they'd already suspected. You know what I think? Fred said. That I'm secretly 40 years old, Harry said. A pause. That's a very specific thing to say, George said carefully. And not entirely inaccurate, Fred added. Harry smiled at them. I'm 11. I just happen to think about things carefully. He picked up his book. How's the canary cream coming? They stared at him. You mentioned it to Ron 3 weeks ago, Harry said. He didn't tell me, he didn't know I could hear him from the other side of the bookshelf. The charm on the suite is straightforward enough, but the timing mechanism for the duration is the tricky part. You need a tempest charm integrated into the transfiguration matrix at the casting stage, not applied afterward. Applying it afterward means the duration is tied to the ambient magic of wherever the sweet is eaten, which makes it unpredictable. Silence. Also, Harry said, you'll need to work out what you want the reversal trigger to be. Laughter is the instinctive choice, but it's contextually unreliable. A time-based reversal is cleaner. Fred and George looked at each other in the way they only looked at each other when something had genuinely surprised them. We'll come back to the, how you know about this part, Fred said. We will, George agreed. But the Tempest integration, come by the library Thursday, Harry said. Bring what you've got. They came to the library on Thursday. They stayed for 3 hours. By the end of it, the canary cream's duration mechanism was solved, and Harry had learned that the twins had a theoretical understanding of magic that was operating well beyond what their grades suggested, primarily because their grades were in subjects that tested what the curriculum wanted rather than what they were actually thinking about. You should take your newts seriously, Harry told them, as they packed up. Newts are years away, Fred said. Newts are what give you the formal credentials to do what you're actually going to do, Harry said. Which is going to require money, supplier relationships, and at some point regulatory approval. All of which are easier with formal qualifications. Another twin look exchange. You know what we're going to do? George said. I know what you're good at, Harry said. And I know that people who are genuinely good at something usually end up doing it, if they're smart enough to build the infrastructure around it. He looked at them. You're smart enough. They left the library in a more thoughtful state than they'd arrived in, which Harry counted as a productive Thursday. December arrived, and with it the first real snow on the Hogwarts grounds and the beginning of the chess tournament that Ron had entered with the calm certainty of someone who knew they were going to win. He was right. He dismantled opponent after opponent with the particular quality of a chess player who genuinely loved the game and also loved outthinking people, and Harry watched him play and saw, more clearly than ever, what Ron was at his core, not the youngest boy, not the overlooked one, not the one in the shadow of his brothers. A tactician. Someone whose mind worked in the spatial, dynamic language of conflict and strategy, and who happened to apply that mind to chess because the world hadn't yet given him anything larger to apply it to. He was going to be something, Harry thought. When the world gave him the larger thing. The Quidditch season had its first match, Gryffindor versus Slytherin, and Harry had prepared for it with the specific focus of Takeda's methodology, which was, do not think about the goal during the preparation. Think only about the preparation. The goal takes care of itself. He'd spent 3 sessions at dawn, alone on the pitch with a borrowed practice snitch, working not on finding it but on the quality of his attention while flying. The attention without focus, the peripheral awareness that let you process the whole field simultaneously rather than tracking a single point. It was a meditation technique adapted for 3-dimensional movement, and it was, he suspected, entirely unique to him. The match itself was clean. Slytherin played hard and not entirely fairly, which Harry had expected and had told Wood to expect, and Wood had spent 2 practices drilling response patterns. The Slytherin Seeker was competent and experienced and playing with a Nimbus 2001 that was technically superior to Harry's school broom by a significant margin. Harry caught the snitch in 7 minutes. Not because he was faster, the broom differential meant he wasn't, quite, but because he saw it a full 4 seconds before the Slytherin Seeker, and those 4 seconds were not about eyesight. They were about the quality of his attention. He was already in the position when the Seeker noticed there was a position to be in. The stands went up like a wave. Harry landed in the noise of it and walked off the pitch and let the team celebrate around him with the full-body joy of people for whom this mattered in the specific, consuming way sport mattered to the young, and he felt it with them because their joy was real and he wasn't going to hold himself apart from it. Wood shook him by the shoulder approximately 6 times in 30 seconds. 7 minutes, Wood kept saying. 7 minutes, 8, technically, Harry said. 7, Wood said firmly, because it was his victory to count. Hermione was at the edge of the pitch, and she'd watched the match with the focused analytical attention of someone who had spent the previous 2 weeks reading about Quidditch strategy so she could follow what was happening, which was such a specific and characteristic thing for her to do that Harry smiled at her from 20 yards. She smiled back, slightly self-conscious about how pleased she looked. The week before the Christmas holidays was the week Harry found the Room of Requirement. He'd been looking for it since October, in the way he looked for things, not by searching specifically but by paying attention, by letting the castle's awareness inform his own. He'd been on the 7th floor corridor 3 times for unrelated reasons and on each occasion had felt something, the same quality of potential presence he'd felt at the hidden door in November. A room that existed when it was needed. He needed it. He stood in the corridor on the Tuesday of the last week of term and thought about what he needed clearly and specifically. Not a general wish, a specific requirement. A space for private magical practice. Advanced level practice. No interruptions. The door appeared in the wall. He stood and looked at it for a moment, and then opened it. The room was large and bare-floored and lit by tall windows that opened onto nothing, some internal light, not the real outside but a convincing analog of winter daylight. It smelled like clean stone and possibility. He stood in the middle of it and held his wand loosely in his right hand. Then he began. He worked for 2 hours, and what he worked on was not the curriculum. The curriculum had its place, he engaged with it genuinely, he respected what it was building, but the curriculum was designed for the average magical practitioner, and he was not average and had not been average across any of the lives where he'd practiced magic. What he worked on here was the next level of the Founders Era theory. The ambient integration. The spell as conversation principle taken further. If spells were nodes in a network, and if casting was a conversation between caster and magic rather than a command, then the limiting factor on what you could do wasn't power. It wasn't even knowledge. It was the quality of the relationship. How well you listened. How precisely you understood what the magic wanted to do naturally and how much you were asking it to do differently. He tested this. He cast spells he knew and felt for the natural tendency of the magic in each one, the direction it wanted to go, the shape it wanted to take, the context in which it would be most efficient. He found that he could extend the range of spells by working with their natural tendency rather than forcing them. He found that the stunner he'd used on the troll, pressed against skin, poured rather than shot, was an example of working with the magic's natural conductance rather than forcing it to travel. He found, at the end of the 2 hours, that there was something else the room was doing. The castle's magic was present here more strongly than anywhere else he'd been, more concentrated, more active. And it was responding to what he was doing. Not passively, not just providing space. Actively. The quality of the air changed when a spell went cleanly, the same way a good teacher changed when a student had a breakthrough. He left feeling changed in some way he couldn't fully articulate, and he came back the next evening. He told Hermione about the room on the third day. She stood in the corridor outside it, looked at the door that had appeared, and said, "I need a comprehensive index of every non-curriculum magical text in the library." The door reappeared. She pushed it open. On the other side was a room lined entirely with bookshelves, every shelf full, index cards on every shelf, cross-referenced by subject, date, and theoretical school. She made a sound he'd never heard her make before. Something that was beyond delight and into something more serious, more personal. "Room of requirement," Harry confirmed. "You said it right," she said. "You said it needed a specific, genuine requirement." "Yes. It gave me exactly, it knew what I actually needed, not just what I asked for." She touched the spine of the nearest book, which was a text he'd been looking for himself and hadn't been able to locate. "It gave me what I needed more accurately than I could have specified it myself." "The castle pays attention," Harry said. She turned and looked at him with the expression that he'd come to associate with her processing something that changed a foundational assumption. "You have a relationship with this building," she said. "Not figuratively. Actually. I think it recognizes something in me," he said carefully. "From the previous, from your other lives," she said. "Because you've done this, been in magical spaces, for long enough that the magic of it is structural in you. And Hogwarts recognizes that because it's been accumulating that same kind of magic for 1,000 years. He nodded. "It's been waiting for someone it could actually talk to," she said softly. He had not thought about it in exactly those terms, but looking at the room around them, the precise fulfillment of what she'd needed, the active quality of the space, the warmth of the castle's presence here, he thought she might be right. They went back to the corridor and Harry stood with his hand on the wall for a moment, and the warmth came again, deep and immediate, and this time there was something in it that felt less like recognition and more like a greeting. Like the difference between noticing a familiar face and being glad to see it. "Hello," he said quietly, as he had before. The warmth intensified. Held. Released slowly. Hermione watched with an expression he'd seen on her face before, in the library over Founders-era texts, when theory became real. She said nothing, which was its own kind of measure of how much it had meant. The last week of term accelerated toward the holiday in the way school terms always did, time compressing, people more themselves, the usual social structures loosening slightly in the warmth of upcoming departure. Ron had won the chess tournament and was dealing with the unexpected attention by being slightly louder and more casual than usual, which was how he handled things he was proud of and unsure he should be. Harry went to Dumbledore's office on the Thursday of the last week. Not invited. Himself. He knocked. He was admitted. Dumbledore was at his desk, and he looked up at Harry's entrance with an expression that cycled through several things rapidly: surprise at the unannounced visit, pleasure at seeing him, and underneath both of those, the steady working intelligence that never stopped moving. "Harry," he said warmly. "What a pleasant, I'd like to talk about the will," Harry said, and sat down. The warmth in Dumbledore's expression didn't leave, but something underneath it became very still. "The will," he said. "My parents' will. Sealed by ministerial authority in November 1981 on the basis of a wartime emergency provision that hasn't been lifted in 10 years. Harry kept his voice entirely conversational. "I've been in correspondence with the ministry about it. I've also retained a solicitor, Greengrass and Associates in Diagon Alley, who has filed a formal request with the Department of Magical Records for a review of the sealing order's statutory basis." Fawkes made a soft sound from his perch. Dumbledore's half-moon spectacles reflected the firelight and gave nothing away. "I see," Dumbledore said. "I'm also curious about the executor's account at Gringotts," Harry continued. "The one with your name as signatory. I don't think anything improper has been done with it, the accounting is precise and the estate has been well maintained. But I'd like a proper handover of that authority, at whatever point is legally appropriate." "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice had the gravity deployed carefully, the specific register he used when he wanted to reframe something as concern rather than confrontation. "These are complex matters. Matters that were managed with your welfare in mind, I believe that," Harry said. "I genuinely do. I don't think any of this was done with bad intent." Dumbledore paused. This was, apparently, also not what he'd expected. "My concern isn't the intent," Harry said. "It's the architecture. The decisions made about my life in 1981, where I lived, how my estate was managed, how I was kept informed or not informed about my own history, those decisions were made for an infant who couldn't participate in them. I'm not an infant." He paused. "I'm also aware that there are things you think I need to learn gradually. Things you're planning to tell me when you decide I'm ready. I'd like to propose an alternative to that approach." Dumbledore looked at him across the desk. His expression had shifted into something Harry had not seen from him before, not the warmth, not the gravity, not the managed twinkle. Something more direct. Something that might have been, in a less controlled man, uncertainty. "What alternative?" he said. "Tell me now," Harry said. "Whatever you think I need to know. About the prophecy, about why I survived, about what you're afraid is coming. Tell me, and let me be an actual participant in what we're both preparing for rather than a piece being moved across a board." Silence. The fire spoke. Fawkes ruffled his feathers and was still. "You know about the prophecy," Dumbledore said. Not a question. "I know one exists," Harry said. "I know it shapes your thinking about me significantly. I know it's almost certainly why I'm here rather than with a wizarding family who could have raised me with full knowledge of who I am." He kept his voice level, without accusation. "I'd like to hear it." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Harry with the expression of a man who has spent years curating a relationship with a specific outcome in mind and has just encountered evidence that the relationship is not what he thought it was, and who is, underneath all his considerable protective instincts, genuinely trying to do what is right rather than simply what is comfortable. He said, "How are you doing this?" Not angry. Not defensive. Genuinely asking. "Doing what?" Harry said. "Being, this," Dumbledore said, and the word was the most unguarded thing Harry had heard him say. 11 years old and, this. Harry held his gaze. He thought about what he could say that would be true and appropriate. He thought about 9 lives and the cupboard ceiling and September 1st. He thought about the choice he'd made, that morning, about what kind of person he was going to be. "I've had a lot of time to think about what matters," he said. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face, complex, private, the movement of a man with a long view being confronted with evidence that his long view missed something. He took off his spectacles and pressed 2 fingers to his eyes briefly, and when he put them back on, something in the careful curation of his expression had shifted. "The prophecy," he said, "speaks of the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord." He gave it to Harry in full. The words he'd been holding for a decade, the weight of them unmistakable even in plain language. Born as the 7th month dies. Marked as his equal. Neither can live while the other survives. Harry listened. He already knew the shape of it, had known it was there, had known it bore on him. The specific word settled into the understanding he already had and added texture rather than new information. "The power he knows not," Harry said, when Dumbledore had finished. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I have believed it to be love. The sacrifice magic. What your mother, it might be love," Harry said. But it might also be something more specific. He thought about Giacomo's alchemy, about Edmund's occultism, about the way he'd felt the castle's warmth and the magic's willingness and the quality of attention that wasn't force. The way I engage with magic, it's not standard. It's not what Voldemort does, what most practitioners do. If his magic is command and mine is something else, a relationship, Dumbledore said, and Harry heard his own word from the conversation with Hermione come back to him, and looked at Dumbledore with genuine surprise. You've been having this conversation with Professors Flitwick and McGonagall through your work without quite having it directly, Dumbledore said, and something wry moved across his face. You are not as unobserved as you think. I'm not trying to be unobserved, Harry said. I'm trying to be honest about what I am. Another long quiet. The room breathed around them, the portraits watching, Fawkes watching, the instruments on their shelves ticking their patient measurements. Quirrell, Harry said. Tonight, or soon? Dumbledore's expression sharpened. What makes you say tonight? He's been moving toward a decision since Halloween, Harry said. The reconnaissance on the night of the troll, that was the last information-gathering step. He's been preparing since. The weather's breaking this week, which limits the castle's external monitoring. And, he paused. The cold presence he's carrying is getting more agitated. It's been pushing harder against Quirrell for the past 2 weeks. He won't be able to hold it at the current level of resistance much longer. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression that was now fully unreadable, something behind the usual transparency. You can feel it, he said. The presence. Yes. Since when? Since September, Harry said. Since the first class. And you didn't, Dumbledore stopped himself. Tell you? Harry let the question breathe for a moment. I knew you knew. The obstacles in the corridor aren't theoretical. You placed them there for a reason and the reason has Quirrell's name on it. I didn't have information you lacked. He paused. What I lacked was your intention. Whether you were planning to let it happen and intervene at the last moment, or genuinely prevent it, or, he stopped. Let the implied third option sit. Or use it. The word he didn't say. Dumbledore's jaw tightened fractionally. The most physical tell Harry had seen from him in 4 months. I would never put you in deliberate danger, he said. I know, Harry said. But designing a set of obstacles calibrated specifically for my skill set, in a building where you know a possessed professor has been working toward that exact location since September, that's a kind of preparation. Even if the intention is protective. The fire was very loud in the silence. What do you want to do? Dumbledore said, and there it was, the question Harry had been working toward without naming it. Asked directly. The power dynamic in the room shifting by the simple action of being asked rather than directed. I want to go to the corridor, Harry said. Not because your obstacles can't be handled, I'm sure they can. But because this is my life and my scar and my choice. And because Quirrell is not the real threat. The real threat is what's wearing him, and that's something I need to face. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of my intention and giving you the opportunity to be involved in the planning rather than managing the aftermath. A very long pause. You're 11 years old, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said pleasantly. Fawkes made a sound like a chord struck on a glass instrument, clear and resonant, and Dumbledore looked at his phoenix for a moment with an expression Harry could only describe as a man consulting something that knew better than he did. Then he looked back at Harry, and the twinkle was absent for the first time, and what was in its place was simply a very old, very intelligent man, tired and genuine. When, he said. When he moves, Harry said. I'll know. He felt it that night. Not through any dramatic signal, not a vision, not a voice. Just the cold presence in the castle flaring like a coal catching air, sudden and purposeful. Harry was sitting in the common room at 10:30 when it happened, most of the other students already in bed, Ron asleep in the chair across from him with a chess magazine open on his chest. He sat up straighter. He felt the cold move through the castle's ambient magic the way you felt a draft through a warm room, the specific direction of it, the deliberate quality. Not scattered awareness anymore. Intent. He stood up. Touched Ron's shoulder. Ron woke immediately, the specific way he woke, all at once, like a switch. He looked at Harry and read his face and was on his feet with the chess magazine closed before Harry had said anything. Now? Ron said. Now, Harry said. Hermione appeared in the doorway to the girls' dormitory. She was fully dressed. She had her wand and a small bag that Harry suspected contained 3 different books and a first aid kit assembled from a Hogwarts medical pamphlet she'd acquired in October. She looked at both of them. I felt something change, she said. You felt it? Harry said. The air in the castle feels different. She glanced toward the window, toward the general direction of the 3rd-floor corridor. It's toward the corridor. Yes, Harry said. Neville appeared on the stairs from the boys' dormitory, wearing his robes over his pajamas and holding Trevor in his left hand and his wand in his right, and looking at all of them with the expression of someone who had made a decision that they weren't going to unmake. I'm coming, he said. Harry looked at all 3 of them. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Dumbledore. About choice and information and not being the kind of person who protected people by managing what they knew. You don't have to, he said. We know, Hermione said. Right, Ron said. Neville nodded, once. Harry let himself feel, for one clear moment, the specific quality of this, for 11-year-old standing in a firelit common room at 10:30, choosing. Not because they'd been assigned this. Not because the story required it. Because they'd looked at the situation and decided this was who they were. He'd had 9 lives. He'd had armies and courts and revolutionary committees and philosophical schools and one very loyal Japanese sword student who had followed him for 30 years. He'd had companions and allies and people who served him and people he served. He wasn't sure he'd ever had this. All right, he said. Stay together. Stay behind me when it matters. And if I tell you to do something, we'll argue about it after, Hermione said. Good enough, Harry said, and led them out of the portrait hole into the dark castle. Chapter 6, What he kept the castle was different at night. Not dangerous, not in itself, but the daytime architecture of it simplified down to something more essential in the dark, the portraits sleeping in their frames, the staircases moving with a slow, considered rhythm like breathing. The torches in the corridors burned low and amber and the shadows they made were deep but not hostile. Harry moved through it with the specific ease of someone who had navigated many things by limited light, in several lifetimes, and felt the castle moving around him the way you felt a familiar current in dark water. Behind him, Ron and Hermione and Neville moved with the contained, careful quiet of people who were afraid and doing it anyway, which Harry thought was better than not being afraid, because people who weren't afraid made optimistic errors. He could feel the cold presence moving ahead of them. Not erratically, with purpose, with direction. It had found a specific path and was following it, which told him Quirrell had done his preparation thoroughly. Whatever obstacles he'd already cleared, he'd cleared in advance. Tonight was the final push. 3rd floor corridor. The door at the end. Harry put his hand on the wall as they moved, the briefest contact, not breaking stride, and felt the castle's response. Awake. Attending. Not alarmed exactly, more like the quality of attention that large old things give to significant moments, the way deep water feels different when something large moves beneath it. They reached the 3rd floor corridor. The door was open. Not broken open, opened. The lock had been worked on with careful, knowledgeable magic that had left no obvious marks. Harry looked at it for a moment, reading the spell residue the way Edmund had learned to read them. The unlocking charm was sophisticated. More sophisticated than a nervous-possessed professor should have been capable of, which told him that the intelligence behind the casting was Voldemort's, not Quirrell's. Quirrell's hands, Voldemort's mind. "He's through," Hermione said quietly, reading the same evidence. "Yes," Harry said. "Going in." He pushed the door and they went through. The darkness on the other side was immediate and total, and then Hermione cast Lumos without needing to be asked and the corridor lit up, stone walls, stone floor, and at the end of it a set of stairs going down, and from somewhere below came a sound that was deep and rhythmic and very much alive. "That's the dog," Ron said. Harry went first down the stairs, the others close behind, and the sound grew until they turned a corner and it was there, 3 heads, enormous, filling the chamber the way the troll had filled the bathroom but fundamentally different in quality because the Cerberus was intelligent in the way dogs were intelligent, and all 3 sets of eyes were looking at Harry with the focused assessment of something that had been asleep and was now working out whether what had woken it required action. It was already confused. Harry could see why. Quirrell had put it to sleep with music, and the harp in the corner was still playing, some enchanted mechanism continuing the tune with the slight mechanical quality of magic sustaining what a person had started. The dog was half awake, muzzy, its 3 heads operating with the slightly uncoordinated quality of something between sleep and alert. Harry stood still. He did what he'd been doing all year in the room of requirement. He listened. Not to the dog specifically, to the magic around it, the old protective magic woven into this chamber that was doing 2 things at once, preventing passage and, underneath that, something more complex. The chamber had its own awareness, faint but present. The castle's magic here was old and had been here since before the stone arrived. He whistled, softly. Not a tune. Just a note, sustained, and then another. The 3 heads turned to him. The middle one lowered slightly. He kept whistling. The harp's mechanical tune continued underneath his, and after a moment, not a long moment, the space of a breath, the middle head lowered fully, the left followed, and the right head held for 3 more seconds and then dropped. All 3 sets of eyes closed. Behind him, nobody said anything. He stepped over the enormous paw, carefully, and the others followed with the specific care of people stepping over sleeping things that could kill them, and he found the trapdoor and opened it. "Fluffy," Hermione whispered, as they looked down into the darkness below. "The 3-headed dog?" "According to Hagrid, apparently." She paused. "How did you do that?" "The whistling?" "Dogs respond to a sustained note in that register," he said. "The harp was already doing most of the work. I just held the same principle." "The same principle is doing considerably more work in that explanation than you're giving it credit for," she said, and dropped through the trapdoor. He followed. The devil's snare was Hermione's, and she managed it better than Quirrell had. He could see the crushed and retreated tendrils where Quirrell had used fire, the plant pulling away from the charred marks with a botanical dignity that suggested it had been offended as much as hurt. Hermione conjured light rather than fire, a clear bright light that made the snare recoil in the same way but with considerably less damage to the plant, and she did it with the ease of someone who had known the answer to this test since she'd assembled her theory of the obstacles in October. She looked slightly smug about this. Harry thought she'd earned it. The flying keys chamber was where the broom damage was visible. Quirrell had taken one and ridden it with the desperate efficiency of someone with a clear objective and no aesthetic interest in the process, and the keys were still in scattered, agitated flight, several of them bent from collision with the walls in their current disturbed state. Harry took a broom and was in the air and had the right key in his hand before the others had fully assessed the room, because flying was the closest this life's body had come to pure joy and the decision-making in the air happened at a level below conscious thought. He unlocked the door and they went through. The chess set was Ron's. Harry had known it would be, had known it from the first time he'd thought through Dumbledore's calibration of these obstacles, this one placed here for a reason that was less about an individual and more about a type. The chess set needed a strategist. It needed someone who thought in the dynamic language of conflict and sacrifice and position, who could hold the whole board simultaneously and make decisions from that whole board understanding. Ron stood at the edge of the chamber and looked at the enormous chess pieces, and Harry watched his face go through the transition, the initial wariness, the assessing, and then the stillness that came over him when he was fully inside a problem he was built for. "We're going to need to play our way across," Ron said. "Not a question." He was already looking at the board. "Yes," Harry said. Ron walked to one of the knight pieces, which was the size of a small horse, and put his hand on it. The piece turned its carved head and looked at him with stone eyes that had a specific quality of appraisal. Ron held the look. The knight dipped its head, a fraction of a degree, and Ron exhaled. "I'm the knight," he said. "Hermione, rook. Neville, bishop. Harry, you're not going on this board." Harry raised an eyebrow. "You need to be whole when you get through there," Ron said, with a directness that didn't allow argument. "Whatever's on the other side, you need to be whole. I can get us through with 3 pieces. He paused, calculating, and the pause had the specific quality of someone doing something very fast in their head. "I'll need to sacrifice 1. He said the last part without drama. "Just information." Harry looked at him. Ron met his eyes with the specific expression he got when he'd made a decision that was correct and complete and he knew it, and was waiting for someone to argue with it so he could explain why they were wrong. "Ron," Harry said. "It'll knock me out," Ron said. "Not kill me. The board follows the rules. I'll be fine." He glanced at Neville. "When I go down, don't stop. Move forward. Don't come back for me, Harry will come back after." Neville nodded. He'd gone pale, but he was holding it with the same quiet steadiness he'd been building all term, the steadiness that lived underneath the anxiety when he had enough cause to access it. "You don't have to," Harry said. "I know," Ron said. It came out exactly as Hermione had said it in the common room an hour ago. The same weight, the same completeness. Harry felt something move in him, the specific feeling of being among people who had made choices, and held it. "Thank you," he said. Ron gave him the brief, embarrassed nod of someone receiving genuine gratitude and not sure what to do with it, which was very Ron, and then turned back to the board and started calling positions. He was extraordinary at it. Harry watched from the side of the chamber as Ron moved them through the game with a clarity and economy that would have impressed the best players he'd known across multiple lifetimes. No wasted moves. No hesitation. The sacrifice came 4 moves in. Ron moved his knight into a position that was deliberately exposed, and the opposing queen came for him with the terrible mechanical force of a chess piece acting at its full power, and the collision was loud and final, and Ron went down in a crumpled heap near the far wall. The path was clear. "Go," Neville said, very quietly, looking at Ron and then at Harry. His voice was steady. Harry went. He looked back once. Hermione was already moving toward Ron, her small first aid bag open, her face set with the focused intensity she applied to problems she cared about. Neville was standing beside her, his hand on Ron's shoulder, his wand out. He went through. The troll chamber was already dealt with. Quirrell had apparently stunned it, and it lay on its side in a state that was visually similar to the bathroom troll from October but somehow more pathetic, a creature used as an obstacle in a game it didn't understand. Harry stepped past it without looking at it too closely. The last chamber before the mirror was the potions room, and it was here that he paused. 7 bottles, an inscription, a logic puzzle. He read it once. The answer was the smallest bottle on the right, based on the rhyme's internal logic. He worked it out in the time it took to read the riddle. He also noted that Quirrell had already taken his bottle and gone through, which meant Quirrell had either solved it or had Voldemort's memory of it from a previous attempt. Either way, the forward bottle was gone. He had the smallest bottle, which held enough for 1. He went through the black flames and through the purple and into the final chamber. The mirror of Ariste stood at the far end. He'd known it was here, had known from the oblique reference in the Founders' Era texts, but the physical reality of it was something the reference hadn't prepared him for. It was vast and ornate, and the inscription along its top caught the torchlight. Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit onwosi. I show not your face but your heart's desire. Quirrell was standing in front of it. He was speaking. Not to Harry, not yet, but to the mirror, or to himself, or to the thing at the back of his head, with the strained, desperate quality of a man who has been at war with himself for so long that he no longer knows which thoughts are his. He was saying, I see it. I see myself, I see, and then stopping. I can't take it from the image, it won't work that way, Harry said. Quirrell turned. He looked terrible. This close, the evidence of the possession was physical, the translucency of his skin, the shadows under his eyes that were nothing to do with tiredness, the faint smell of cold that had been growing since September and was now a constant ambient thing. Whatever was left of Quirinus Quirrell was running on the last reserves of a man who had made a bad decision a year ago and had been paying for it ever since. Harry felt something that surprised him. Not fear, he'd processed the absence of fear about this encounter weeks ago. Not triumph. Something closer to grief, for the man who had been there before the decision, and who was barely visible now. Potter, Quirrell said, and his voice was layered. His voice and something else underneath it. Come here. I'm fine here, Harry said. The mirror, Quirrell said. You need to look in the mirror. I know, Harry said. I will. But I'd like to talk first. The layered quality of Quirrell's voice shifted. The something underneath pushed forward, and Quirrell's face changed, the anxiety replaced by something cold and ancient that wore his expressions like borrowed clothes. Talk, said the thing in Quirrell. How very like your father. He wanted to talk too. Harry held still. The cold presence was looking at him directly now, through Quirrell's eyes, and the quality of the regard was extraordinary, the full weight of Voldemort's awareness, stripped of his body and his power and most of his coherence but not stripped of his intelligence, not entirely. It was looking at him with the specific recognition of something that had pressed against him before and found something unexpected. What did you find, Harry said, when you looked at me in the defense lesson? In October. A pause. The cold presence was still, in the way powerful things went still when they were deciding. Something old, it said, through Quirrell's mouth. Something that has no business being in a boy your age. No, Harry agreed. What are you? Harry thought about the question. He'd been asked variations of it all year, by Ron, by Neville, by Hermione, by Dumbledore, in different forms and with different intent. He'd given different answers to each of them, calibrated to what the moment needed. To this question, from this source, he gave the most honest answer he had. Someone who's died 9 times, he said. And kept coming back. The cold presence absorbed this in the way that intelligence absorbed unexpected information, not rejection, not acceptance, processing. Then, you remember them? Yes. All of them? Yes. Something moved in Quirrell's face, the borrowed expression doing something that might, if you were being generous, have been called recognition. The cold intelligence behind it was ancient enough and reduced enough to have a different relationship with death than the living, and what it had just heard might have read differently to it than Harry had intended. Then you understand, it said, that dying for others is a fool's act. That survival is the only principle that holds. I understand that it's a principle you believe, Harry said. I've known people who believed it. Emperors and generals and revolutionary leaders. It usually ends badly. It has not ended for me, Quirrell said. You're possessing a dying man, Harry said. That's not survival. That's a very slow ending. Quirrell's face tightened. The stone, it said. Give me the stone and live. I don't have the stone yet, Harry said. I haven't looked in the mirror. Then look. In a moment, Harry said. First, why do you want more time? You've had 50 years. You've been powerful enough to shape the entire magical world. What do you need that you haven't had enough time for? The cold presence flared, not rage, something sharper. You think you understand, I think you're afraid, Harry said, simply. Not of me. Of the actual ending. The one that doesn't have another host and another plan and another terrible year of being half a thing in someone else's skull. He kept his voice entirely even. I've been afraid of dying. I've been afraid of it in 9 different lifetimes in 9 different ways. It doesn't go away. But you've built every decision you've ever made around avoiding it, and all you've managed to do is make the thing you're afraid of get worse. Silence. The mirror reflected the room and nothing else from Harry's angle. He was too far to the side to see its face. Look in the mirror, Quirrell said again, but something had shifted in the voice. The command was less certain. The cold presence was, not listening, exactly, but it had a quality of something that had been waiting for a long time and had been given, unexpectedly, something to think about. Harry walked to the mirror. He stood in front of it and looked. He had expected, he wasn't sure what he'd expected. His parents, perhaps, which was what the mirror was supposed to give him, or a version of himself holding the stone, or some layered combination of desire that reflected the complexity of what he was. What he saw was simpler than any of those things. He saw himself. Older, not dramatically older, a few years. Standing in the castle, in winter light, with Ron and Hermione and Neville visible behind him, just visible, in the background, the way people who were actually present in a life were visible, not the foreground, not the performance, just there. There in the permanent, structural way. And he was smiling, not at anything specific, just at the general condition of being where he was. That was it. No great triumph. No crown or war prize or power. Just that. He felt something in his robe pocket. He looked down. In the mirror, his reflection reached into its pocket and drew out a small, red stone that caught the torchlight and held it. He felt the weight of it in his actual pocket. The stone, delivered by the mirror's magic, exactly as Dumbledore had designed it to work. He closed his hand around it. You have it, Quirrell said, and Voldemort's presence was fully forward now, filling the borrowed face with cold hunger. Give it to me. Harry turned from the mirror with the stone in his closed fist and looked at Quirrell across the chamber and made a decision. No, he said. Not defiantly. Not dramatically. Just no, the way you said no to something that wasn't complicated. Quirrell moved. Harry had expected this, had been tracking Quirrell's body language from the moment he'd entered the chamber, reading the tension in the stance, the preparation. Quirrell was a grown man, technically, with the magical instincts of a trained defense professor underneath everything Voldemort had done to him. The first spell was fast and aimed well, and Harry sidestepped it and responded without thinking, not the stunner, not force. He used what he'd been practicing in the room of requirement, the extended range principle, the working with the magic's natural tendency principle, and what he cast was not an offensive spell. It was a containment. A net of magical force that worked with the room's ambient magic, with the castle's presence, which was very strong here, in this chamber that had held an extraordinary object for months, and it caught Quirrell like a tide catching a swimmer, not violent, not crushing, simply present and holding. Quirrell strained against it. His wand came up. And then Voldemort's awareness pressed outward, looking for the channel to override the containment, and Harry felt it coming and did something he'd only done once before, in the defense lesson in October, but more deliberately this time. He looked back. Not with aggression. With the full, clear quality of his actual attention, 9 lifetimes of accumulated self, the entirety of who he was and what he'd been, looking back at the cold presence with absolute steadiness. Voldemort flinched. It was not a word that should have applied to Voldemort, even reduced and half-formed as he was, but it was what happened. The cold presence recoiled from the contact the way it had in October, but this time the contact was sustained, and Harry understood something he hadn't fully understood before. The love magic that had protected him at a year old, it was still in him. Not sentimental. Not passive. Structural, in the way that the castle's magic was structural. His mother's death had put something in him that was alive and specific, and that Voldemort, who had built everything around the avoidance of connection and sacrifice, was constitutionally unable to withstand. Not because it hurt him physically. Because he couldn't look at it. He could not look at what Harry was, and what Harry was included 10 lifetimes of choosing, always, to connect. To care. To come back, lifetime after lifetime, to the same fundamental decision, that the world was worth being in and the people in it were worth knowing, even knowing it would end. Quirrell screamed. Not Voldemort's voice, Quirrell's own, the buried man coming to the surface for the first time in months, pain and something under the pain that might have been relief. His skin where the containment touched him was blistering, which Harry hadn't intended and couldn't prevent because it was his mother's magic doing it, not his, and his mother's magic apparently had very clear opinions about Voldemort. He let the containment go. Quirrell crumpled. Voldemort came out of him. Not bodily, not a form, not a shadow shape, just the cold presence unmoored, filling the room for one moment with an intensity that dropped the temperature 10 degrees and made the candles in the wall brackets gutter. It passed over Harry like a wave. He stood in it and felt it and held the stone and didn't move. The cold found nothing to grip. It moved through him the way wind moved through a space it couldn't fill, looking for purchase, for fear, for something it could use. There was nothing to use. It passed on. The temperature came back up. The candle straightened. Harry stood in the empty chamber and looked at Quirrell on the floor and felt the stone in his hand and breathed. He checked Quirrell's pulse. Faint but present. The man was alive. Dumbledore arrived 4 minutes later, which meant he'd been closer than his office. Harry didn't comment on this. He held out the stone when Dumbledore entered the chamber, extending it toward him in an open palm, not with ceremony but with the flat practicality of someone returning a thing that needed to be in better hands. Dumbledore looked at him across the chamber. The torchlight was low and amber and the room smelled like cold and old magic and the aftermath of something significant. He took the stone. He looked at it. He looked at Harry. He looked at Quirrell. Voldemort, he said. Gone, Harry said. For now. Not destroyed, he doesn't have a body to destroy. Gone. And Quirrell, alive. He needs significant help. Harry paused. Medical and otherwise. He was carrying something for a year that he didn't choose to carry, at least not knowing what it would cost him. I'd like someone to remember that when they're deciding what to do with him. Dumbledore was looking at him with the expression he'd had in the study, the one without the twinkle, the one that was simply a very old man encountering something he hadn't fully prepared for. But it was different now. There was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not deference, something more nuanced than that. The look of someone who has been corrected on a subject they thought they mastered and is deciding to be grateful rather than defensive. You didn't use the obstacles, Dumbledore said. I used some of them, Harry said. My friends used most of them. He met Dumbledore's eyes. They were there by choice. I didn't lead them there. They decided. I know, Dumbledore said quietly. I've been watching the passages since you left the tower. He paused. Mr. Weasley is going to be fine. A mild concussion. Miss Granger is with him. Mr. Longbottom has not moved from the chess chamber since Mr. Weasley went down and has apparently been reorganizing the chess pieces for a rematch, should one be required. Harry felt something expand in his chest. Of course Neville had reorganized the pieces. The stone, Harry said. What are you going to do with it? Dumbledore looked at the red stone in his hand. Nicholas and I have discussed it, he said. He is old enough and wise enough to understand what the stone's existence means in a world where Voldemort is still present. He's prepared to let it be destroyed. Good, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. You're not troubled by that? The loss of something so remarkable? Remarkable things that keep powerful people alive past the natural end of their wisdom cause more problems than they solve, Harry said. Flamel's life has been extraordinary. He understands when something extraordinary should end. He paused. Most people don't, but he does. Something crossed Dumbledore's face at this, privately, quickly. A thought he didn't share. Harry let him have it. Some things were for the person alone. They went back through the chambers together, Dumbledore carrying Quirrell with a levitation charm and a care that Harry noticed and catalogued, the genuine care, not the performed kind. Whatever Dumbledore's methods, his feeling for the people those methods affected was real. He moved Quirrell with the tenderness of a man who understood that he'd put this person in an impossible position. Harry walked beside him and said nothing about this because he didn't need to. Hermione met them at the chess chamber. She had cleaned a cut on Ron's forehead and he was sitting up with the slightly dazed expression of someone who'd taken a hard knock and was refusing to acknowledge it. Neville was beside him, and the chess pieces were indeed reorganized, not for a rematch but into a complex defensive arrangement that suggested Neville had been thinking about strategy while waiting and had done it through the medium available to him. Ron looked at Harry. "You all right?" "Yes," Harry said. "Stone?" "Dealt with." Ron nodded. "Good." He tried to stand, made a face, and accepted Hermione's offered arm with the specific expression of a person accepting help and immediately planning to forget that they accepted it. "Neville," Harry said. Neville looked up. "That arrangement," Harry said, gesturing at the chess pieces. "Is that what I think it is?" Neville looked at the pieces and then back at Harry. "I didn't want to just stand there," he said. "It's a three-position defensive coverage," Harry said. "For 3 different attack vectors simultaneously." "I wasn't sure it was right." "It's right," Harry said. "Ron, look." Ron looked at the arrangement from where he was standing and was quiet for a moment. That's correct," he said, with the honest surprise of someone recognizing genuine spatial intelligence. "How did you? I've been playing chess with you since October," Neville said, turning pink. Harry let himself feel this for a moment, just this, the 4 of them in a stone chamber under the school at midnight with an unconscious professor floating nearby and a chess arrangement that nobody asked for and everyone needed, and then he smiled, and it was the smile with 9 lifetimes behind it, except that this time he didn't bother to pull it back into something smaller. He let it be what it was. The hospital wing was the next several hours. Madame Pomfrey handled Ron with the brisk affection she applied to injuries that were serious enough to treat and not serious enough to truly alarm her, and she looked at Harry's shoulder, the troll bruise, fading but still visible, with the professional displeasure of someone who has been told a student is fine and has found evidence to the contrary. "Halloween," Harry said. "Halloween was weeks ago," she said. "It's been fine," he said. She treated it anyway, with the manner of someone who has heard this exact argument from students since 1963 and has never found it compelling. Dumbledore came to the hospital wing near 3 in the morning and talked to each of them briefly, separately. When he came to Harry, he pulled a chair to beside the bed Harry had been assigned and sat in it with the quality of someone who had nowhere else to be, which Harry thought might have been true. "I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him. "I built a situation around you," Dumbledore said, with the directness of someone who had decided that half measures were no longer appropriate. "With the best intentions, which I am aware is not an excuse, only a context. I decided what you needed to know and when, and I designed your first year around a shape I thought was necessary." He was quiet for a moment. "You dismantled it. Not with force. Not with defiance. You just walked around it, and then offered me a better arrangement." "You took it," Harry said. "Eventually," Dumbledore said, with something that might have been self-deprecating humor in a man more practiced at it. "You built what you built because you were afraid," Harry said. "Not of me. For me. You knew what was coming and you wanted to make sure I'd be capable of it. That's not a bad impulse." It's just, you built a hero when what you needed was a person. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. And which are you? A person, Harry said. Who's capable of the hero part when it's needed. That's better than the other way around. Dumbledore was quiet. The hospital wing was silent around them. Hermione and Neville had been released and Ron was sleeping in the next bed with the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who'd been knocked out and come back and was now simply tired. The prophecy, Dumbledore said. You heard it and you haven't asked me what I think you should do with it. No, Harry said. Why not? Because I'm not going to let it tell me who to be, Harry said. If it plays out the way it says it will, then fine, I'll be here and I'll be ready and I'll deal with it because I've chosen to. Not because it's written. He paused. The power he knows not. You think it's love. I think you're right, but I think it's more specific than that. He looked at the ceiling, the hospital wing ceiling, white and plain, nothing like the 9 other ceilings he'd woken under. I think it's the specific power of someone who isn't afraid of dying. Who has died, knows what it is, and has decided that this life is worth living anyway. That's not a mystical quality. That's a choice. And choices are stronger than prophecies. Dumbledore absorbed this. He sat with it, visibly, in the way he hadn't sat with things earlier in the year. The earlier version of these conversations had been him listening carefully and then redirecting. This was something different. This was simply sitting with something said. You'll come back next year, he said finally. Yes, Harry said. The year after that. Yes. Whatever comes, I'll be here, Harry said. But I'll be here as myself. Not as the boy who lived. Not as the piece that walks into the trap. He met Dumbledore's eyes. As Harry Potter. Who happens to have some relevant experience and good friends and no particular interest in dying again. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment, and then he did something Harry hadn't expected. He laughed, quietly, genuinely, without performance, the laugh of someone who has found something funny in spite of themselves. Again, he said. I misspoke, Harry said pleasantly. Of course, Dumbledore said. He rose, straightened his robes, and moved toward the door with the unhurried grace that was simply his nature, no performance in it at this hour, in this room, just a very old man who was tired and had been corrected and was going to think about it seriously. At the door he paused. Harry, he said. Your parents. He turned. The will. The estate. Greengrass and Associates are an excellent firm. I won't obstruct it. Harry held his gaze. Thank you. The properties should be yours to know about, Dumbledore said. The one in Wales especially. There are things there your father left. Books, primarily. Notes. He paused. I thought knowing about them too early would be a distraction, Harry said. Yes. Tell me when, Harry said. Not when you decide I'm ready. When you actually have time to show me. Together. Dumbledore held his gaze for a long moment, and the expression on his face in that moment was the most unguarded thing Harry had ever seen on him. It was the expression of a man who had, for 10 years, cared deeply about something he'd handled badly, and had just been offered the possibility of doing it differently. Yes, he said. Together. He left. Harry lay back on the hospital wing bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to Ron's quiet sleeping and the distant sounds of a castle settling into the deep hours of the night. He thought about the mirror. About what he'd seen in it. About the desire it had revealed, not power, not victory, not the answer to the prophecy. Just the continued presence of people he'd chosen, against the permanent background of a place he'd come to love. That was what his heart wanted most. After 10 lifetimes of losing things, of beginning and ending, of accumulating and releasing, that was the desire at the core of him. Not invulnerability. Not permanence. Just this specific collection of people, in this specific place, for as long as it lasted. He thought about Ron, who had laid down on a chessboard for a person he'd known 3 months, because that was simply who Ron was. The sacrifice wasn't a decision, it was a reflex that came out of something deep and unbreakable in him. He thought about Hermione, who had looked at 9 past lives and said all right and gone straight back to work, because knowledge was what she was made of and she wasn't going to stop just because the knowledge got complicated. He thought about Neville, reorganizing chess pieces in an empty stone chamber at midnight because he didn't want to just stand there, because being useful was the thing that connected him to himself. He thought about the castle. About the warmth it gave back when he touched its walls. About the room of requirement, and the library, and the flying, and the deep October nights spent over Founders-era texts with firelight on parchment. He thought about Dumbledore, who was complicated and powerful and had made real errors in judgment and was apparently willing to be corrected by an 11-year-old, which was, in Harry's experience of powerful people across several centuries, genuinely unusual. He thought about the stone, which Flamel was going to let be destroyed, because he understood when extraordinary things should end. He thought about Voldemort, cold and moving through the night somewhere with no body and no stone, and felt nothing that could be called fear. Something more like the knowledge of an oncoming season, the certainty that it would come and the equal certainty that he would be standing here when it did, and that the between-time was worth everything. It was September 1st again, in his memory. The cupboard ceiling. 9 lives clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. The decision made before breakfast, in the thin yellow light of a Surrey morning, while Petunia moved in the kitchen and the trunk sat packed and ready at the door. He had refused the role. He had refused to be the piece, the hero-shaped object, the boy moving through the designed experience toward the designed outcome. He had taken the life that had been handed to him and he had lived it, not performed it, not executed it, lived it, with his full attention and his full self and the particular quality of presence that came from knowing exactly how limited and precious any given life was. He had made friends. Real ones. The kind you found in lifetimes where you were lucky, and he had been lucky, and he knew the difference between luck and inevitability and didn't confuse them. He had walked into the mirror and seen the thing he actually wanted, and it was simple, and it was enough. He was 11 years old and he had 9 lifetimes in him and the 10th was going very well. Outside the hospital wing windows, Scotland was doing what it did at this hour, the particular deep dark before the winter sunrise, the mountains invisible and present, the lock still, the castle breathing. The torches in the corridors burned low. The portraits slept. The chess pieces in the chamber below stood in Neville's defensive arrangement. Somewhere in the castle, the room of requirement was waiting, full of questions nobody had asked yet. Somewhere in Wales, a property Harry had never seen held books and notes left by a father he barely remembered and was going to get to know, slowly, in his own time, with Dumbledore who had offered to show him together. Somewhere distant and cold, Voldemort was nothing but intention looking for a home. Harry would be here when he found one. He'd be here with better magic and better friends and a relationship with this castle that was going to keep deepening, and with 9 lifetimes of knowing that endings weren't the end, only the end of one particular thing, and that what you held on to, what you actually kept, from any given life, was never the power or the victory. It was always the people. It was always the morning you woke up and they were still there. He closed his eyes. Outside the window, very slowly, Scotland began to go grey with the beginning of something that would, eventually, become dawn.